greatest enemies, and therefore removed access to Iranian oil reserves from America's economy, further constraining America's supply. But somewhat paradoxically, Texas momentarily benefited tremendously from the rise in global oil prices across the 1970s, as production in the state was still pretty high and oil was the state's primary industry. The skylines of Dallas and Houston boomed dramatically during this time period, but then in the 1980s, the price of oil finally fell out and collapsed. And with its fairly undiversified economy at the time, Texas fell into a deep oil-induced recession alongside it that spread throughout the whole state's economy. Ambitious buildings that were planned to be constructed during the 80s in cities like Dallas and Houston had to be abruptly canceled as the oil money began running out. Like this very ambitious Art Deco-inspired 100-story tower that was planned for Dallas in the 80s, but was never even started. By 2005, it had been more than 30 years since Richard Nixon claimed America would be fully energy independent within a decade. But 30 years on, America was importing more oil from abroad than it ever had before in its entire history. 60% of America's oil consumption was coming from imported sources from abroad, though by this point, only 20% of those imports were still coming from the Middle East. But nonetheless, nearly everyone back then believed that America's oil imports would only continue growing even higher. By 2007, oil production within the Permian in Texas had hit its all-time low, and nearly everybody believed that the United States was doomed to be the world's largest importer of oil and natural gas indefinitely, with a chronic overdependence on foreign suppliers who could potentially weaponize their energy resources to harm the country, like during the Arab oil embargo. But then, as if out of nowhere, a technological revolution in the oil and gas industry beginning in Texas started to quickly change everything, just like it had originally done a century previously back in 1901. Petroleum engineers and geologists working in the Barnett Shale region of North Texas were the first who managed to put together two previously unrelated technologies to produce a revolutionary and unconventional new result. They had combined horizontal well drilling with hydraulic fracturing, and in doing so, came up with a new, if slightly misleadingly labeled technique called fracking. Fracking ultimately enabled energy companies to do what was previously believed to be impossible: economically harvest petroleum resources like crude oil and natural gas out of non-porous sedimentary shale rock deposited hundreds of millions of years ago beneath the surface of oceans. And as it so turned out, Texas was once covered by an ocean many hundreds of millions of years ago. And so the state consequently had a massive amount of petroleum-rich shale rock deposits beneath its surface, ripe for the new fracking technique to exploit. From the Barnett Shale region in North Texas, tens of thousands of unconventional fracking wells began suddenly getting drilled all across other newly discovered shale plays, like the Eagle Ford sedimentary basin running through south and southeastern Texas. And then, all eyes began once again turning back towards the gigantic Permian Basin over in West Texas. In 2012, the first successful horizontal shale well was drilled in the Permian, and the fracking boom had come to what had once been America's greatest oil field. And as it turned out, the Permian, too, was absolutely covered with previously inaccessible petroleum-rich shale rocks beneath the surface. As a result, in a period of just 7 years, from 2007, when the Permian hit its lowest point of production, to 2014, Permian oil production more than doubled from 850,000 barrels a day to more than 2 million. And it was once again accounting for a full quarter of America's entire production of oil. As it turned out, fracking revealed that Texas contains several of the largest oil and gas fields that have ever been discovered anywhere in the world. The Spraberry and Wolfcamp field in the Permian is generally now regarded as the second largest oil field on the planet, behind only Saudi Arabia's largest oil field at Ghavar. The Eagle Ford is now regarded as the world's fifth largest oil field, ahead of the Samovar field in Siberia, the largest of all of Russia's oil fields. And even better, the massive Texan shale oil and gas fields are all perhaps the most strategically well located of all the major petroleum reserves on the planet. These aren't the massive oil and gas fields of Saudi Arabia. They're all located in the very sparsely populated deserts of the east of the country and hemmed in by the major maritime choke points of the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, and the Suez Canal, with major geopolitical threats immediately nearby, making Saudi oil and gas challenging to build infrastructure around that is required to get it out to world markets. These likewise aren't the massive oil and gas fields of Russia, all of which are located deep within the interior of sparsely populated Siberia that is similarly difficult to build infrastructure to and from that is required to get them out to the world market. Instead, the massive Texan shale oil and gas fields, among the largest anywhere in the world, can be found almost precisely where many of America's largest cities and most advanced infrastructure had already been built. Overlap the map of Texan shale oil and gas fields with Texan population density, and remember the 22 million people that live within the Texas Triangle. The Barnett Shale region largely runs over Dallas-Fort Worth. The Eagle Ford spans right through the center of the triangle and runs right nearby to San Antonio, Austin, and Houston. Mighty Permian Basin is only a bit further to the west of the triangle and is well connected to it by highway and rail that can take the basin's oil and gas directly to the Texan coast for easy, immediate, geopolitical risk-free access to the Gulf of Mexico and the world's oceans from there. Assuming, of course, that Cuba isn't under the control of a major hostile foreign power, which has, from time to time, been the case before, but not currently. Within just 5 years, from 2009 to 2014, the fracking revolution, along with Texas's geology and the location of its mighty shale reserves nearby to major infrastructure links and the ocean, all resulted in Texan oil production more than tripling. And within time, it would accelerate even faster. By today in 2023, the fracking revolution has enabled Texas alone to become the producer of 43% of America's entire nationwide production of oil and 25% of America's production of natural gas. Far higher amounts than any other single state has been capable of achieving. Texas now produces even more oil than Iraq. And if it were an independent country, it would be the world's fourth largest producer, barely behind the rest of the United States and then Russia and Saudi Arabia. Texas further produces more natural gas now than either China or Qatar. And were it to be its own country, it would possess the fourth highest production of natural gas on the planet, just barely behind Iran. And then even further, Texas controls the largest amount of crude oil refineries out of any U.S. state as well, and thus possesses the largest ability out of any of the states to refine crude oil into finished products like gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. As of 2021, there are a total of 31 petroleum refineries in Texas, largely concentrated around the Gulf Coast, that collectively account for about a third of America's entire crude oil refining capacity. And that grants Texas the ability to refine more oil than India and every other country in the world besides for Russia, China, and the rest of the United States. As a result, the second Texas oil boom that began in the early 2010s has proven to be nearly as massive a development for the state as the first oil boom was in the early 20th century, and has been a further primary factor in the state's recent extraordinary growth rate. And even better this time around, when the price of oil inevitably comes down again in the future, the state's economy is well diversified enough to weather through the storm. Unlike in the past. The Texan shale boom, along with smaller but still significant shale booms in other states like North Dakota, has ended up completely crushing everybody's predictions back from the 2000s about the United States being doomed to become the world's largest importer of oil and gas. Quite to the contrary, Texan oil and gas production heavily contributed to the United States finally regaining the title of the world's largest oil producer from Saudi Arabia in 2018. A title that America had lost more than 40 years previously, and a title it still would not have without Texas or fracking. By 2015, Texas and the United States were already doing what had previously been thought of as impossible. That December, a tanker in Corpus Christi loaded up with crude oil drilled from the shale in the Eagle Ford and set sail for France, representing the first major export of U.S. oil abroad since the 1970s. The United States had suddenly returned back to the world stage again as the largest oil and gas power in the world, and the reverberations shook across the globe. As the United States slowed down its imports of oil and gas from abroad, America's trade deficit was also rapidly declining. By 2019, the United States had dramatically slashed down on its net oil imports from the peak of 60% of total supply back in 2005 to less than 3% of total supply. And then as the United States became by far the world's largest producer of natural gas, of which Texas produces a quarter of, the country gained the ability to use this abundant natural gas to produce some of the cheapest electricity and cheapest chemicals seen anywhere in the developed world. America's seemingly bottomless supply of natural gas established by fracking after the 2010s and its reliable electricity grid compared to its peers has become another primary factor in encouraging manufacturing to relocate back to the United States. And And specifically, manufacturing and chemical firms have been largely relocating their operations from abroad to the Gulf Coast region around Texas and Louisiana, where the gas and electricity rates are so insanely cheap since they're right by the sources of the gas, and from where the ability to export finished products to the rest of America and to the world is so good that even some Chinese companies have relocated their manufacturing operations there, because the cheap electricity and cheap shipping costs outweigh the relatively cheaper Chinese labor. And then, of course, there are the geopolitical advantages to America once again producing the highest amount of oil and gas in the world. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, the European Union acted quickly to slash its imports of Russian oil and gas in order to deny the Kremlin funding that would help to pay for its war machine. The shale revolution in Texas and the United States helped the European Union do this in more ways than one. For starters, were it not for the shale revolution, the United States would still almost certainly be the world's largest importer of oil and gas, and would therefore be directly competing for the limited outside world supplies with Europe right now, meaning that the price Europe would have had to pay to replace Russia's oil and gas would be far higher than it really was. But because of the shale revolution, the United States was not only hardly importing any oil and gas from the Middle East or elsewhere at all, and thus was better freeing up those resources for Europe, but it was also producing enough to export to Europe itself. Since the Russian invasion, Texan and American oil and gas have been flowing in container ships across the Atlantic to Europe in a deluge that resembles the Allied supply effort during World War II. As a result, America suddenly displaced even Qatar as the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas this year in 2023, as it found itself the second largest provider of gas to the European Union at 20% of their total imports, only behind Norway and first at 31%. The gas has of course been accompanied by Texan and American oil, as by the end of 2022, 18% of the European Union's oil imports were also all coming from across the Atlantic. The end result has dramatically blunted Vladimir Putin's ability to blackmail the European continent with energy warfare, and it's deprived the Russian army of billions of dollars in potential funding as American oil and gas coming in on ships from the West moves in to largely replace the Russian oil and gas that was coming in through pipes from the east. And the vast majority of America's ability to do all of this countering without firing a single shot has all come from the state of Texas.
I have no idea how that happened.
And then Texas doesn't just lead the United States in oil and gas production either, but also in renewable energy. This is a map of America's regions with the highest potential to generate electricity from wind power. The windiest part of America, indeed one of the windiest places on the entire planet, runs straight down the Great Plains from North Dakota through the Texas Panhandle, North Texas, and Central Texas. By comparison, nowhere in continental Europe does it get anywhere near as windy as it does in these areas of Texas. The only locations with similar wind potential here are within the European offshore regions of Denmark, northern Germany, and the UK, and the Aegean Sea between Turkey and Greece. Consequently, Texas possesses a major ability to harvest a lot of power from wind, and it does. There are more than 150 wind farms in the state already that collectively produce over 30,000 megawatts of power and provide for around 16% of the entire state's electricity needs. That's by far the highest amount of wind power generated by any U.S. state. If Texas were an independent country, it would rank 5th in the entire world by wind power generation, in addition to 5th in natural gas and 4th in oil. And then to just keep adding on to Texas's energy advantages, you can further measure the state by solar energy potential, where, once again, it contains some of the best solar potential land in the entire country across the western portions of the state. And so, solar already accounts for another 4% of Texan electricity. Wind, solar, and nuclear combined provide for around a third of Texas's total electricity needs and are growing greater all the time, enabling the state to export even more of its vast oil and gas supplies to other states and other countries who need them more. Texas is therefore effectively one of the world's greatest energy super provinces, because it contains many of the largest and the most productive oil and gas fields on the planet, one of the largest refinery capabilities on the planet, some of the windiest and sunniest locations on the planet, a strategic position in the center of North America, granting it the ability to easily export many of those resources across the continent, and a long coastline free of major maritime choke points to export those resources around the world from. Texas is America's greatest energy province, and the boom that the energy industry has been providing the state over the past decade and a half has reverberated across every other industry in the state, from tech, finance, to aerospace, and more, which has all collectively led to Texas being the fastest growing of all America's states in raw numbers of people during the 21st century. Time by the 2040s, Texas may indeed finally end up even surpassing California to become America's newest, most populous, and most influential state. Time will tell. We'll see if I'm right 20 years from now. Now, as a nearly lifelong resident of Texas myself, I'm prepared to admit that I may be a little biased towards my people. The Netherlands is a small country in the northwest corner of Europe that most people these days associate with urban planning YouTubers and amazing bicycling infrastructure. But at first glance, this country may still appear rather unassumed. It's only a little larger than the U.S. state of Maryland is, but with a population of nearly 18 million people all contained. The Netherlands is among the most densely populated countries anywhere in the world. The country's density of people is about on a par with India, and when excluding small city-states, the country is the densest population of people in Europe, behind only Malta, which itself is only a tiny island. Nonetheless, 18 million people is still a rather small population at a global scale, and it's only enough to make the Netherlands the 69th largest country in terms of people. Well, of course, in terms of land, the country is even smaller and ranks down at only 131st place worldwide. But despite not having a lot of land and not having a lot of people, the Netherlands punches far, far above its weight in global importance. And I'm going to argue here that the Netherlands is by far the most overpowered country relative to its size in Europe today. Take the country's exports, for example. Somehow, despite being among the world's smaller countries in terms of land and people, the Netherlands is among the absolute biggest countries in the world in terms of how much stuff they export out to the global market. In terms of value of goods and services, the Netherlands is currently the 5th largest exporter in the entire world, pumping out way more goods and services for the global market than dozens of other countries many times its size are capable of, like India, the UK, or Italy. And when you dig deeper into what kinds of goods and services the Dutch are exporting, it still gets even more interesting. It probably shouldn't be a surprise to most people that the United States of America is the most dominant agricultural superpower in the world. The country has the second highest amount of total arable land in the world behind only India, while the United States even further completely controls the largest continuous stretch of farmland located anywhere in the world too. The Mississippi River Basin. With a population only a fraction of India's, the United States is capable of producing far more food than it actually needs for itself. And so, it's no surprise then that the United States is the largest exporter of agricultural products in the world. But if you had to guess which country is the second largest exporter of agricultural goods in the world, your mind might wander around other huge countries with extensive farmland like Russia, Ukraine, France, China, or even Brazil. Very few people would immediately know that despite only having 5% of the population as the United States, and despite the United States possessing a whopping 234 times more land, the little Netherlands is actually the second largest exporter of agricultural products in the world, and is somehow able to pump out more than 2/3 of all the agricultural goods to the world market than America does. Once again, beating out countries that are way bigger than it, like Brazil, Germany, and China in the process. In terms of global trade, the little Netherlands is truly one of the world's great powers, and that brings with it some majorly outsized economic power. Despite only being the 131st largest country in terms of land and only the 69th largest country in terms of people, the Netherlands is the 17th largest country in terms of economic size, controlling an annual GDP that is larger than Turkey's, despite having only 1/5 of the population. Perhaps even more impressively, the Dutch economy is presently more than half the size of Russia's, the biggest country in the world that sprawls across Eurasia and that has more than 8 times as many people as the Netherlands does. So how did the Netherlands manage to pull off this massively outsized influence on the world stage? What is it about this country that makes it the most overpowered in Europe? And why is its influence so frequently overlooked today when it really shouldn't be? To begin with, it's important to clarify how the geography of the Netherlands directly lends to the country's ability to project trade power, and always has. The country occupies this perfectly positioned spot that's almost dead in the center of Europe, roughly equidistant from Spain and Portugal in the west and from Russia in the east. This position has always made the Netherlands a natural stopover point for trade between Russia and Scandinavia in the east, and Spain and Portugal in the west. An advantage that is only massively amplified by the fact that many of Europe's mightiest rivers empty out directly at this location as well. The Rhine, Meuse, Scheldt, and Ems rivers all empty out in the North Sea through the Netherlands and are all highly navigable for most of their lengths, granting easy commercial access to the Dutch coast deep into the hinterlands of Germany, Switzerland, and France that can be traversed by cheap and easy-to-use river barges. This has made the Netherlands ideally positioned for commerce and trade for centuries. But it's also a double-edged sword, because the rivers emptying out here essentially means that the entire country is basically a giant river delta that's almost surrounded by water, and the Dutch relationship with water virtually defines this entire country. The water simultaneously presents a major threat and a major opportunity to the Netherlands. On the one hand, the very name of the Netherlands, translating roughly into English as the lowlands, gives a hint towards how much of a danger the water can pose. Roughly 26% of the country's landmass today is beneath sea level, and about half of the country is beneath 1 meter in elevation. The country is notoriously flat and low-lying, and the highest point in the entire country is located in the extreme south, far away from the ocean, and only stands at 322 meters high, which is basically just a big hill. This is why, when it comes to average elevation, the Netherlands is the 7th lowest country in the entire world and by far the lowest country in Europe. And even that's not really very fair, because most of the countries that are lower than the Netherlands are tiny Pacific Island states, and none of them are anywhere near to being as geographically large. So you have all of this super low-lying land directly adjacent to the North Sea, and all of these huge rivers that empty out into the country that basically make the Netherlands the gutter of Europe. All combined to make the Netherlands among the most catastrophically flood-prone countries in the world. Even today, more than 1 in 5 people in the Netherlands lives in an area that's beneath sea level, or about 3.7 million people. In many countries around the world, their biggest national security threat is their immediate neighbors. Ukraine and Finland prepare for attacks from Russia. Israel prepares for attacks coming from all around them. India prepares for attacks from Pakistan, and South Korea from North Korea, and so on. In a sense, the Netherlands is no different today. But rather than any of their borders on land, it is their border with the sea that is the biggest threat. And rather than any attacks from human beings, it is attacks from the ocean itself that poses the greatest national security threat to the Dutch people. For centuries, the people who have lived here have fought tirelessly to push the ocean back and keep the water out of their lands. The evidence of which is littered all across the country today in the form of windmills that pumped water out of sodden farmland, canals that took the water out to the sea, and dikes that prevented more water from gushing in. More than 700 years ago, back in the 14th century, the Netherlands looked a lot more like this, with significant amounts of the country we know today being buried beneath the sea. Even the location of modern-day Schiphol Airport, the busiest airport in the Netherlands and the 3rd busiest airport in Europe, was underwater back then. But over the many centuries since that time, generation after generation of people in the Netherlands have spent their lives steadily pushing the water back with the aforementioned windmills, canals, and dikes to the point where by the start of the 20th century, the Dutch had reclaimed roughly 1,285,000 acres worth of land from the sea and by draining lakes. But the Dutch didn't always want to push the water out of their country all the time. Sometimes they wanted to let it in as well. Since the Netherlands is a small but densely populated country that's about as flat as a pancake, the Dutch have never really had many natural geographic features to protect themselves against outside invaders coming from France or Germany. But in the 17th century, they realized that deliberately flooding their own low-lying lands in a controlled manner could serve the same defensive role that mountains do for other countries. And so, their geographic weakness of being susceptible to flooding could be cleverly transformed into geographic strength, too. Over a period of 200 years from the 17th to 19th centuries, the Dutch tirelessly constructed the water line, a series of water-based defenses that could be deliberately flooded in the event of an invasion to protect Amsterdam by nearly transforming the Holland region into an island. Later on, between 1880 and 1920, the Dutch constructed an even more extensive system of water-based defenses completely encircling Amsterdam that they called the Amsterdam Defense Line. The line formed a huge ring around the city of Amsterdam that could be deliberately flooded to a shallow depth of about 30 centimeters or 12 inches, deep enough to be a geographic hindrance to infantry and cavalry, but shallow enough to prevent an enemy from using boats across it. Unfortunately for the Dutch, however, the creation of the Amsterdam defense line roughly coincided with the invention of the airplane and the tank. And so, by the time that Germany invaded the Netherlands in 1940, the Amsterdam defense line was already obsolete. Nonetheless, over the centuries from 1300 to 1900, where the Dutch reclaimed nearly 1.3 million acres of land from the sea and lakes in the country, they also lost another 1.4 million acres of land area to the Zuiderzee, a shallow bay of the North Sea that was only about 4 to 5 meters deep that existed in the northwest of the country just to the east of Amsterdam. There had long been discussions within the Netherlands to drain the Zuiderzee and reclaim huge amounts of the land within it for human settlement for centuries. But the technological ability for them to actually do that was lacking up until around the late 19th century. It was then in 1891 that a man named Cornelis Lely actually drafted up a feasible plan to drain out the Zuiderzee, a plan that would become the basis for the later Zuiderzee works that would completely and radically transform the geography of the Netherlands forever. In 1916, a violent storm sent a surge of water from the North Sea into the Zuiderzee that overwhelmed several dikes around it and caused wide-scale flooding, which provided the impetus for the Dutch government to officially begin carrying out Cornelis Lely's grand vision for taming the Zuiderzee he had come up with 25 years previously. The first step of the plan called for the construction of a huge dam across the northern section of the Zuiderzee, here running between the Dutch provinces of North Holland and Friesland. The dam would be 32 kilometers or 20 miles long and would come to be called the Afsluitdijk, or the closure dike in English. As its name suggests, the Afsluitdijk was built to isolate the saltwater Zuiderzee from any access to the salty ocean in the North Sea, and it took the Dutch years of effort to construct it between 1927 and 1932. After it was completed, the dam was designed to include a series of sluice gates that enabled the Dutch to begin draining salt water out of the Zuiderzee, while fresh water would continue flowing into the sea from the River IJssel. Over time, this meant that the Zuiderzee was transformed from a salty outlet of the North Sea into a brand new freshwater lake that the Dutch renamed the IJsselmeer, or the IJssel Lake. And even further, the Afsluitdijk also serves as a causeway, enabling Dutch travelers to drive their vehicles directly from North Holland to Friesland without having to travel all the way around the Zuiderzee like they used to. Now, the original plan of the Zuiderzee works was that after the sea was enclosed by the Afsluitdijk and tamed, huge tracts of new land would be built within the new IJsselmeer called polders, which are essentially chunks of an area within the lake that the Dutch would dam off from the rest of the lake with dikes, after which the water enclosed by the dikes would all get pumped out to reveal fresh, dry virgin land suitable for colonization. The first of these polders within the IJsselmeer that the Dutch constructed was this one here called the Veringermeer, that was fully drained to water by 1930, an early proving concept and testbed that influenced the ideas and techniques used in all of the subsequent polder construction going forward. Veringermeer opened up about 307 square kilometers of extra land to the Netherlands that was incorporated within the North Holland province, and more than 12,000 people live there today. A few years later, work on the second polder, named the Noordost polder, began in 1936 and was eventually fully drained out and ready for settlement by 1942. And then, after the conclusion of the Second World War, work finally began on the single largest land reclamation projects in the entire Zuiderzee works, in the south of the IJsselmeer. Originally intended to be a single massive polder, work on dredging up Flevoland finally began in 1950. But several changes were made to the original plan as they went about it. The development of the previous Noordost polder left the new, lower-lying land in the polder directly connected to the older and higher elevated mainland, which led to groundwater from the higher mainland seeping into the new lower land, which led to the ground in the mainland to start sinking and causing all kinds of problems. The original plan for the Flevoland polder was to leave it connected to the mainland as well. But after observing the problems with the Noordost polder, the Dutch decided to change the design of Flevoland into two separate halves, an eastern Flevoland polder and a southern Flevoland polder, with a narrow southern channel of water separating both of them from the mainland. Unlike the two polders that came before it, Flevoland was both geographically large enough and close enough to the major city of Amsterdam that Dutch planners knew it had the potential to host major cities on it after it was finished being dredged up. As a result, after Eastern Flevoland was finished being created in 1957, and after Southern Flevoland was finished up a decade later in 1968, they became the site of the biggest planned cities on the new polders, like Almere, strategically and conveniently located only about 20 kilometers away from the bustling city center of Amsterdam, the Netherlands' biggest city. Almere is therefore the most recently settled city in the Netherlands that was only established in 1975, and is also, probably to my knowledge, the largest city in all of Europe that was only settled in the 20th century. The very first house in Almere was only finished in 1976. Fast forward roughly half a century later to today, and Almere has ballooned to a population of about 215,000 residents, making it the largest city to be established on any of the new Dutch folders and the 8th largest city in the Netherlands nationwide. And by 2030, Almere plans to construct enough housing to boost their city population up to 350,000 residents, which by that point could make Almere the 5th largest city in the country. By 1986, the Netherlands did something that no other country in Europe had done in the 20th century. They declared a brand new province out of their freshly created land they had conquered from the sea. Dubbed the Flevoland province, it encompasses all of the newly created land in the Noord-Holland polder and the southern and eastern Flevoland polders, representing a total amount of land that's larger than Hong Kong that was conquered not through brute military force at the expense of others, but through decades of brilliant and forward-looking engineering for the benefit of the state. The creation of the Flevoland province from nothing has dramatically assisted the housing crisis in the densely populated Netherlands too. As of 2023, about 445,000 people live within Flevoland on land that didn't even exist only a few decades ago, as is symbolized by the province's official anthem, called Where We Make Cities Rise. Today, roughly 20% of all the land in the Netherlands have been reclaimed from the sea at some point or another over the past 700 years, representing an area of land that is larger than nearby Luxembourg that has been conquered by Dutch engineers rather than by Dutch soldiers. And the country still isn't finished yet with reclaiming even more land from the sea either. You see, the original plan for the Zuiderzee works called for another 5th polder to be constructed here in the southwest of the IJsselmeer. It was going to be called the Markerwaard polder, with a narrow canal between it and the southern Flevoland polder leading directly to Amsterdam so that Amsterdam would maintain its maritime access to the rest of the lake. The Markerwaard polder, had it ever been built, was planned to add another 410 square kilometers of colonizable land to the country's territory, about equivalent to the Hawaiian island of Lanai in scale. Between 1963 and 1975, the Dutch slowly constructed what many believed was the prerequisite step for this 5th polder, a large 28-kilometer-long dike or dam across the IJsselmeer that split the lake into two that became known as the Human E.P. After its completion, the Human E.P. divided the IJsselmeer into two separate, distinct lakes, which led to the lake to the west of the Human E.P. becoming known as the Markermeer Lake, and the rest of the IJsselmeer staying named as the IJsselmeer. The Human E.P. also provided a direct overland connection for vehicles to take between Flevoland and the northern part of North Holland. And after its completion, the Markerwaard polder was originally intended to be developed out of the Markermeer Lake. But then, for decades, none of that ever ended up happening. On the one hand, those in favor of pushing on with the Markerwaard polder argued that it would open up new airport land, create new housing, and open up the possibility of building a brand new airport close by to Amsterdam to relieve congestion at Schiphol Airport. But on the other hand, those in favor of keeping the Markermeer as a lake argued that in the case of a drought, the lake's water would be useful for a drinking water supply, and that during heavy weather events, the lake would serve as a valuable buffer zone protecting Amsterdam and Almere from the wrath of the sea. Concerns over the Markerwaard's financial liability began to emerge in the 1980s as the debate continued on, and the project was eventually indefinitely suspended in 1986, and then completely canceled altogether later on in 2003. But the discussions on dredging up land within the Markermeer never fully went away, and they got officially revived somewhat in 2012, when a new project was proposed to build out a series of smaller artificial islands behind the Human E.P. within the area that was originally proposed for the much larger Markerwaard polder. Unlike the originally proposed Markerwaard, these smaller islands aren't intended to be inhabited by humans, but are meant to serve as a wildlife refuge and tourism destination instead. The first of the islands was dredged up as virgin land in 2016, and several more islands have been built out since then as the newest land in the Netherlands and in Europe. But the conquest of these new lands from the sea is not the only thing that the Dutch have accomplished in their centuries-long war with the sea, because they've also fought tirelessly to keep the sea out from everything that they've spent generations building. Flooding has been a constant concern in this country since time immemorial. And in 1953, the country suffered an extremely devastating one. A powerful storm gathered in the North Sea and sent a huge surge of water smashing against the southward coast of the Netherlands, in between the Zeeland province and Rotterdam. The levees and dikes in the area were overwhelmed and breached in dozens of locations, sending the storm surge through and flooding nearly 1,400 square kilometers of land in the country. The resulting destruction was utterly catastrophic. More than 1,800 people in the Netherlands were killed by the water's fury, while 9% of the country's farmland was inundated with seawater and 10,000 buildings were destroyed. The disaster produced so much grief and shock in the nation that the entire country collectively vowed that such a thing should never be possible in the future again. And so began the impetus for another decades-long macro-engineering project in the country that became known as the Delta Works. While the Zuiderzee works were primarily offensive in nature, conquering new land from the sea, the Delta Works were designed to be more defensive in nature and would ultimately prove to be effectively the Dutch version of China's Great Wall. In 1958, the Dutch government pledged to spend a whopping 20% of its total national GDP on the project that would be spread out over the next 25 years. For about the next 3 decades after that, the Dutch society built out a massive series of dams, dikes, levees, sluices, locks, and storm surge barriers all across the provinces of Zeeland and South Holland that were most severely affected by the 1953 flood, the aim of which was to effectively reduce the length of the Dutch coastline and reduce the number of dikes that had to be raised in order to better defend this part of the country from the wrath of the North Sea. There are many incredibly impressive feats of engineering that the Dutch pulled off during the Delta Works project, but a few of the most impressive include the Oosterscheldekering, translated into English as the Eastern Scheldt Storm Surge Barrier, that was constructed over the course of a decade between 1976 and 1986. This single giga project is the largest single storm surge barrier ever constructed by humanity, and it basically serves as a gigantic gate that protects the inner part of the Netherlands' Zeeland province from the North Sea. Its sluice gates normally remain open to allow water to freely travel between both sides, but in the event of a dangerous storm surge emerging in the North Sea, the sluice gates can be slammed shut, and the Oosterscheldekering transforms into a protective shield to keep the water out. One of the other greatest marvels of engineering the Dutch created in the overall Delta Works project was right here at the artificial mouth of the Rhine River, only about a 30-minute drive west of downtown Rotterdam, the second largest city in the Netherlands and home to the country's biggest port. Rotterdam is a city that is particularly vulnerable to flooding naturally, because about 90% of the city's area lies beneath sea level, and it's located directly adjacent to the Rhine and very close by to the North Sea. Thus, between 1991 and 1997, the Dutch constructed a massive storm surge barrier right at the mouth of the river that they called the Maaslandkering. The structure consists of 2 gargantuan arms, each roughly the size of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, and each about twice as heavy, making the structure the largest moving object that humanity has ever created. When water levels in the North Sea are detected to be high enough to cause a storm surge through the river towards Rotterdam, the Maaslandkering gates can be given the order to close in a process that takes 2.5 hours to complete. After which, the enormous water pressure in the North Sea gets transferred from the wall of the gates to the 2 largest ball joints in the entire world, implanted on the river's banks, each one having a diameter of 10 meters and a weight of 680 tons. An advanced computer system can automatically close and open the gates based on the water levels on either side. And it, along with the rest of the other massive projects in the overall Delta Works program, were designed to protect the Netherlands from even a once-in-10,000-year intensity storm. It's a small wonder, then, that the Delta Works defensive program and the Zuiderzee Works offensive program together were named as one of the 7 wonders of the modern world by the American Society of Civil Engineers in 1994. And all of this extensive experience at fighting against the ocean like nobody else has over decades and centuries have made the Dutch the foremost global experts in protecting themselves from rising sea levels in the global ocean. A problem that will only continue getting worse for billions of people all around the world in the 21st century as global climate change continues to increase the ocean's sea level. This has ended up perfectly positioning the Dutch to be the global leaders at climate change adaptation for coastal cities and communities everywhere in the world. And Dutch consultants already travel all around the world to other coastal communities threatened by sea level rise like New York, Miami, New Orleans, Jakarta, and the entirety of Bangladesh, offering up their expertise and knowledge and bringing back more money and wealth to the Dutch economy in the process. The entire nationwide system in the Netherlands of dikes, dams, pumps, and sluices is so impressive that without any of them, a 2007-era study from Calvin University in the United States found that 65% of the Netherlands would be completely underwater during high tide. As the famous saying about the Netherlands goes, God may have created the earth, but the Dutch created the Netherlands. No other country in the world has been as meticulously over-engineered and created by its people over generations than the Netherlands has been. And that long history of cooperation and collective effort against the sea has produced a unique culture in the country that prioritizes trust, collaboration, collective good, and efficiency over everything else. Attributes that spill out into the rest of the country in sometimes surprising ways. From the intelligent designs of Dutch cities and infrastructure to prioritize human beings over cars, to the shepherding of Schiphol Airport's strategic location in the center of Europe, to become the third busiest airport on the continent behind only Charles de Gaulle near Paris and London Heathrow. But another major geographic advantage to power, especially to trade power, that the Netherlands has always had is their incredibly lucky possession of the Port of Rotterdam. Today, the Port of Rotterdam sprawls out across a huge area that's larger than the island of Manhattan in New York. With 4 fully automated terminals that accept vessels around the clock at all times of the day, every day of the year. The water depth within the port is deep enough to handle even the largest of container ships that have ever been built. Its central location is almost dead in the center between Western and Eastern Europe, and the connections that stretch out from the port to the European market are just completely unmatched anywhere else. From Rotterdam, navigable rivers like the Rhine, the Meuse, and the Scheldt extend deep into the hinterlands of Germany, Belgium, France, and Switzerland. And since 1992, when the Rhine-Main-Danube Canal was completed and opened, the navigable parts of the Main and the Danube rivers are also accessible, which has opened up the hinterlands of Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Ukraine, all to inland shipping connected to Rotterdam as well. Cheap-to-operate river barges from all of these countries can easily travel through this network of rivers directly to Rotterdam and transfer their cargoes onto massive ocean-going container ships for export anywhere in the world. While they can also receive imports through the same system from anywhere else as well. But it's the Netherlands itself that has by far the densest network of inland waterways in Europe. The country is home to 2,200 kilometers worth of navigable internal waterways that are used for commercial shipping, and that account for 40% of all the international freight movement within the country, and 20% of the country's domestic freight travel. With roughly 6,000 ships sailing through its various rivers and channels, the Dutch inland waterways account for a staggering nearly 80% of all the vessels that sail inland within the entire European continent, enabling the Dutch to move around cargo much more efficiently and cheaply than any other country in Europe is even remotely capable of. And it's not just water-based transportation that's so easy from Rotterdam either. The port acts as a hub of several different transportation systems that radiate out from it, including railways and highways. The Betuwe-route, for example, is a double-track freight railway line that runs directly from Rotterdam to Germany, where it links up with Germany's Oberhausen-Arnhem Railway, which extends all the way down to the northern reaches of the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland. The Ruhr metropolitan area is the largest urban conglomeration in Germany and the second largest in the entire European Union, with a population of around 11.3 million people and an annual GDP on its own of $580 billion in 2021, which would make the Ruhr Valley all on its own the world's 25th largest economy if it was independent. And all of the goods it produces can be easily transported by railway, river barge, or truck directly to Rotterdam for export out to the global market. Railroads emanating from Rotterdam can move goods as far away as Brest, Marseille, Berlin, and Augsburg in under 8 hours. And most of the continent can be reached by rail in under 24 hours. The port operates thousands of direct connections around the world by sea, rail, and truck, and it's essentially the most convenient and easy-to-access port for around 500 million consumers throughout the European continent. It's no wonder then that for a very long time, the port of Rotterdam was the busiest and largest port in the entire world, all the way up until the year 2004, when it was finally overtaken in annual cargo tonnage by the port of Singapore. Since then, Rotterdam's business has been overtaken by several additional ports in China. But Rotterdam continues to remain by far the busiest port in Europe and the busiest port in the world, located anywhere outside of East Asia. Its importance to Europe from a commercial perspective is so enormous that it still handles more cargo tonnage than the next two busiest ports on the continent combined, nearby Antwerp and faraway Novosibirsk. The port of Antwerp in Belgium benefits from much of the same geographic and infrastructure advantages as Rotterdam does, and taken together, they handle about as much cargo as the next 7 busiest ports in Europe do all combined, spanning across Russia, Germany, Spain, Romania, France, and Poland. The port also contains 5 major oil refineries owned by giants like Shell and Koch Industries that enable the Netherlands to be a major hub of the global oil industry as well. As of 2022, the Netherlands has become the 6th largest importer of crude oil in the world, that they bring in from just about everywhere. But they transform so much of that crude oil at the refineries in Rotterdam into finished end products like gasoline that they become one of the top 3 global exporters of refined petroleum products, placing themselves just narrowly behind the likes of India and the United States in the process. What's really astonishing about this is that the Netherlands manages to export more refined petroleum products than even traditionally thought of oil superpowers do, like Russia, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, simply because the Dutch possess Rotterdam and control the vital refineries there that can actually transform crude oil into usable end products. And because they control the start of the pipeline network that radiates out from Rotterdam towards Belgium, France, and the industrial Ruhr region in Germany, they can quickly carry petrochemical products to exactly where they're needed. And the reason why this extensive pipeline network exists in the first place is because it also just so happened that in addition to sitting atop of the Rhine-Meuse Scheldt River Delta with all of its unique geographic advantages, the little Netherlands also sat directly atop of the largest natural gas field that would ever be discovered on the European continent as well, right here, the giant Groningen gas field. This is another part of the story of the Netherlands' ridiculous OP status that is critical to understand. The Groningen gas field was only discovered by the Dutch in 1959, but it radically transformed the Netherlands forever afterwards. The field is actually the 10th largest natural gas field ever discovered globally, and it was central to the transformation of the Netherlands into Europe's most substantial natural gas supplier. Pipelines were built out that radiated out from the field and connected the entire country, and eventually a good deal of Europe to its gas supplies, while the revenues and taxes earned on the field's production were central to the development of not only the Dutch welfare state, but to everything else that the country did. The land reclamation projects, the Zuiderzee works, and the protective engineering of the Belgian works. Over the whole period of Dutch natural gas production between 1959 and 2018, Groningen and various other smaller fields dotted all over the country, a total of 417 billion euros of equivalent in cash were earned, with at least 85% of that amount being captured by the Dutch state, which greatly funded the country's ability to actually develop itself with the Zuiderzee and Belgian works. The Groningen gas field was eventually agreed to be phased out of production in 2015, and as of 2023, it has largely ceased all production. With its huge contribution to the Dutch economy over decades, Now, because of its central location and myriad connections all throughout Europe, the port of Rotterdam is also a major so-called re-exporter of goods as well, making it a huge hub of goods sold into the Eurozone area from outside countries like the UK, the US, and China. As an example, 1/5 of all the fresh fruit and vegetables that get imported into Europe from somewhere else come through via the Netherlands alone. And the port of Rotterdam alone accounts for more than 8% of the entire Netherlands' GDP. Now, it shouldn't come as a surprise to you then, the enormous advantages of controlling Rotterdam and most of the Rhine-Meuse River Delta have enabled the Dutch to be a major trading power for centuries. Across the 17th century, the Dutch enjoyed their golden age when they basically invented capitalism, established a near complete monopoly on segments of the world's high street, and carved out one of the most influential and globally spanning trade empires the world has ever seen. Enormous wealth flowed back to Rotterdam, Amsterdam, and the rest of the country. With the creation of that trade empire became a territorial empire with another that once spanned all across the globe, from Indonesia to India to South Africa to the Americas. And while while this territorial overseas empire gradually crumbled and fell apart, especially in the 20th century during the era of decolonization, the global Dutch trading empire never actually really went away alongside it. Far to the contrary, the Dutch largely kept their global trade empire generally intact, buttressed by their continued control of Rotterdam and their endless drive to expand the port's connections to the rest of the continent and to protect the port from the fury of the sea. The Netherlands is therefore still the fifth largest exporter of goods and services by value in the world, with even more exports pumped out to the global market than even countries like India, the UK, or Italy are capable of, and with a volume of exports that are close to approaching Japan's, a maritime nation with more than 7 times the Dutch population. Interestingly, of all the top 10 countries in the world by exports, all of them are generally regarded to be modern great powers of the 21st century, except for the Netherlands and Singapore, which each just punch way, way above their weights in this category. And it's not just the exports of refined petroleum products that the country excels at either. As I mentioned at the start of this video, the Netherlands have somehow recently emerged as the second largest exporter of agricultural products in the world as well, managing to export more than 2/3 of the agricultural products by value as the United States does, with only 5% of the same population and 234 times less land. Despite being located only around 1,600 kilometers from the Arctic Circle, the Netherlands has managed to earn the title of the world's second largest exporter of tomatoes, behind only Mexico. While the country is the absolute largest exporter of other major agricultural products like potatoes and onions. Ornamental plants like tulips have long been associated with the Netherlands, but they were only introduced to the country by the Ottomans in the 16th century. And since that time, the Dutch have come to absolutely dominate the tulips production. A whopping 90% of the global production of tulips takes place in the Netherlands these days, and 80% of the world's tulip exports all come from here alone, giving the Dutch a practical monopoly on the tulips production, even in the 21st century. The start of the Netherlands' incredible rise to dominance in global agricultural and food production is often said to have begun in the desperation of the Second World War, when, over the winter of 1944 to 45, the Netherlands became the most recent Western country to suffer from a debilitating famine, in which as many as 22,000 Dutch people lost their lives. In the aftermath of the war and the ravages of the famine, the Dutch realized that with very limited available land in their waterlogged and densely populated, rainy country, they have become masters of efficiency in the agricultural business, in order to ensure a reliable food supply. Just as they became masters of efficiency at huge investments were made by the Dutch government into farming subsidies to stimulate the country's agricultural sector. And then, nearly 2 decades ago, the country gave itself a challenge to produce twice as much food using only half as many resources. And since that time, the country has dramatically expanded the scope and scale of its technological innovations in farming to far, far exceed that original goal. Today, the Netherlands has some 24,000 acres of crops growing within artificial greenhouses, an area more than twice as large as the island of Manhattan. And these greenhouses are absurdly efficient. The temperatures and climates within them can be precisely controlled by farmers. LED lights can give the plants precisely how much light they need. Destructive pests can be easily kept out of them, eliminating the need for chemical pesticides. The plants within can be watered with precisely the correct amounts of water so they don't get too little or too much. And in many of them, even the carbon dioxide that gets generated by burning natural gas to keep the power going in them is simply piped directly back into the greenhouses by massive ventilators. Air just gets converted into oxygen by the plants, achieving 99% efficiency in the process. The result is that within these hyper-efficient greenhouses, the Dutch can grow fruits and vegetables year-round around the clock with bigger yields than anywhere else in the world. A single acre of land put beneath a greenhouse in the Netherlands is capable of growing the same yield of produce that would normally take 10 acres of traditional dirt farming to accomplish with significantly fewer resources to boot. The average amount of water that it takes a Dutch farmer to grow 1 pound of tomatoes is only a half gallon, while the average worldwide is about 28 gallons, 56 times more water than what Dutch farmers use. The epicenter of the Dutch greenhouse farming movement is in the Westland region of the country, directly to the west of the huge port of Rotterdam. Here, you will find an almost endless landscape of glass greenhouses from above, where 80% of the region's agricultural land is all contained within one. This hyper-efficient farming region alone contributes roughly half of all the horticultural production in the entire country. And its location directly next door to the port of Rotterdam enables its products to immediately travel all around the world to markets everywhere. The Netherlands is also home to an enormous amount of research and development in the agricultural industry as well. The country hosts the incredibly prestigious Wageningen University and Research Center in the middle of the country that is widely regarded to be the global leader in agricultural science and research. And it basically forms the nucleus of the entire country's agricultural sector. Various agricultural science companies in the Netherlands spend hundreds of millions of dollars annually on research and development, which results in hundreds of new varieties of vegetables and seeds that are coming out of the country on an annual basis. Seeds themselves are another huge business in the country, with the Netherlands now dominating more than a third of the global trade in vegetable seeds, because the Dutch are damn good at producing extremely valuable seeds since they spend so much money on seed research and development. One Dutch agricultural company called Rijkswaard managed to develop a tomato seed that costs less than 50 cents, but which is capable of producing an astounding 150 pounds worth of tomatoes. So valuable are the high yield and weather and pest resistant seeds that Dutch companies like Rijkswaard produce that they are literally more valuable than gold. Since 1 kilogram of gold currently as of this video's production costs around $78,000, while 1 kilogram of Dutch engineered tomato seeds can easily go for over $100,000. And this is all how today, little Netherlands has managed to find itself in the position of growing 6% of all the food produced in Europe on only 1% of the continent's actual farmland, and how the Dutch have managed to become the second largest agricultural exporter in the world behind only the United States. And agriculture is hardly the only modern industry that the Dutch have managed to capture and nearly monopolize parts of. An industry that's even more lucrative, both from a financial and geopolitical standpoint, has been the country's unique cornering of a key component in the global semiconductor and microchip industry that could ultimately make the Netherlands the kingmaker in who between the United States and China ends up winning the 21st century. If you asked a random person where the capital of the global tech industry is located, many would probably respond with San Francisco and Silicon Valley, with its host of tech companies present. Others might suggest Seattle, where Microsoft and Amazon are headquartered, while others may insist on Taiwan, where the bulk of global semiconductor manufacturing takes place at. But very few would argue that another contender for the capital of global big tech is here in a small suburb of the Netherlands' fifth biggest city called Veldhoven. A fairly small town with only 45,000 residents that you probably never even heard of until right now. But Veldhoven is extremely important despite its small size because it is the headquarters of a company that you may also have never heard of called ASML, an acronym for Advanced Semiconductor Materials Lithography. As it stands currently, ASML is the third most valuable company by market cap anywhere
Legs off. Chop his legs off. Witness me!
over just the past 5 years since 2019. The reason why ASML has exploded onto the world scene these past few years is because they're literally the only company in the world that builds the tools that are required to produce the most advanced semiconductors and computer chips that go into pretty much everything, from smartphones to guided missiles to artificial intelligence. A 21st century Dutch trade monopoly that's probably even more influential and powerful than the Dutch monopoly over the spice trade during their golden age was in the 17th century. You see, ASML was founded 40 years ago back in 1984 as an unlikely-to-succeed joint venture between the Dutch electronics giant Philips and another company called ASM International, which built semiconductor equipment. The new company, ASML, planned to produce machines that specialized in a process known as photolithography, which itself has history that goes back decades before ASML's founding. Photolithography is a complicated process whereby a blueprint of small circuits are crafted by beams of light that are guided through a series of lenses and mirrors towards a photosensitive silicon wafer. The light will essentially create the design of the computer chip layer by layer, which eventually forms circuits that goes on to create the computational foundations of our entire modern world. Now, the precise kind of light used by photolithography machines is incredibly crucial to understand. And early on, back in the 1960s, when this technology was first coming around, they primarily relied on using only visible light beams, which have a relatively large wavelength and are only capable of building out pretty large features on the silicon wafer, which is undesirable because the smaller you can get the transistors, the more of them you can pack onto the silicon wafer, and the more powerful the chip ultimately becomes. Smaller and smaller wavelengths of light were steadily used by photolithographers to build more and more powerful chips until ASML came around in the 1980s to throw their hat in the ring too. By 1986, ASML had produced their first prototype photolithography machine, but it was extremely rudimentary and was only capable of creating individual transistors on the scale of micrometers. And it was basically more of a glorified photocopier than a true marvel of engineering. The company struggled to actually find customers, and the leaders at the time gave it to the Japanese firms Canon and Nikon. So ASML was only kept alive for years by its parent company, Philips, and by subsidies that came from the Dutch government. But by 1995, ASML was still able to grow just large enough to go public and list itself on the New York Stock Exchange. Just as the company was beginning to bring out a new photolithography machine that would harness a new idea called extreme ultraviolet, or EUV lithography. You see, visible light has a wavelength that ranges between 380 and 750 nanometers, while ultraviolet light is much smaller with a wavelength that only ranges between 100 and 400 nanometers. Which means that by the 1980s and 90s, when photolithography machines were harnessing ultraviolet light, they were capable of producing much smaller patterns on chips than the previous generations of visible light machines were capable of. And so, computing power was getting stronger. Extreme ultraviolet light, or EUV light, is a fraction the wavelength of even regular ultraviolet light, ranging only 13.5 nanometers. For decades, nobody had quite figured out how to actually use EUV light in photolithography machines to produce even smaller transistors because working with it is an absolute devil of a task that requires an absolute mastery of physics to actually pull off. Canon and Nikon, the industry leaders at the time, were pursuing EUV technology as well, but abandoned it by the early 2000s. Doubts emerged as to whether or not it was even going to be possible. ASML, however, stuck to the course of pursuing EUV technology regardless of the skeptics and sunk massive amounts of capital and time into research and development of the tech. Over 17 years, from 2000 up until 2017, ASML blew through $6.5 billion on EUV research and development, and had only managed to ship out a handful of products over that entire time. But then, finally, after all that time and all that cash, in 2017, the long bet of ASML and the Netherlands on EUV technology would finally pay off. They actually managed to roll out an EUV photolithography machine that not only worked extremely well, but also actually made economic sense to purchasers of the machine. The 16 EUV machines that ASML produced were not cheap, costing around $100 million each to buy. They could print so small and do them quickly enough that all of the gigantic semiconductor manufacturing companies immediately ordered some. From TSMC in Taiwan to Intel in the United States to Samsung in South Korea. ASML sold 10 of these $100 million machines in 2017 alone, and dozens of additional orders were placed on backlog. After decades of effort, ASML in the Netherlands suddenly emerged in 2017 as the only company in the entire world that was producing EUV lithography machines, essentially establishing a complete monopoly on the product. And since then, ASML's photolithography machines have only gotten more and more advanced, and they're difficult to manage. Their machines are now capable of creating features on a silicon wafer that are down to 1/50,000th the width of a human hair. Each one of their machines contains more than 100,000 parts, and they weigh about 180 tons, while they're about the size of a double-decker bus. Inside of them, the machines will drop 50,000 tiny droplets of molten tin that are each no fifth of a human hair, traveling at more than 250 kilometers per hour through a chamber every second. which all gets zapped by a pair of outrageously precise lasers that creates a plasma that releases the EUV light that is then guided by lenses towards the blank silicon canvas that eventually becomes a chip. The mirrors required to guide this EUV light are ground down to probably be among the finest in the entire universe. They are so impossibly smooth that the largest imperfection is no more than the distance grass will grow in a single millisecond. If the mirrors were scaled up to the size of the Earth, there would be no bumps or imperfections on them larger than a single millimeter. And since EUV light gets absorbed by just about everything, including by air, this entire process has to take place within the machine in a total vacuum. Each of their newest EUV machines now cost more than $300 million to purchase, about the same price as a brand new Boeing 777. And they are almost certainly the most highly sophisticated tool that humanity has ever produced and sold commercially. Even transporting one of these machines from ASML's factories in Europe to customers around the world is an insanely difficult and expensive process. The machines have to be assembled and tested in the Netherlands first to make sure they actually work. And if they're successful, the machine will be completely disassembled and transported to its customer using 20 trucks and then 3 fully loaded Boeing 747 jumbo jets. ASML has more than 5,000 supplier partnerships that it uses to build these fantastic machines. And each one requires the labor of about 100,000 people to actually create. They are very, very difficult to actually replicate, and so far, nobody else has managed to create an economical EUV lithography machine. And even if somehow someone else did, they would have to convince the small number of ASML's customers to abandon ship and switch providers, which will be hard because ASML already has the established relationships. There's basically 5 total customers in the entire world who buy these machines, and ASML is continuing to innovate and advance their own machines. This is all how ASML is going to dominate a whopping 83% of the global lithography market right now in 2024, with their sole monopoly on the production of EUV lithography machines. And it has made the entire outside world extremely reliant on the Netherlands and on ASML. Such is the importance of ASML lithography machines that the former president and CTO of ASML, Martin Vandenbrink, exclaimed earlier this year that our prime minister was sitting in front of Xi Jinping, not because he was from Holland. Who'd give a shit about Holland? He was there because we are making EUV. Naturally, because ASML's EUV lithography machines are required to create the most advanced computer chips that are necessary for building the most advanced military equipment, the two global superpowers, the United States and China, are increasingly growing more and more dependent on the Dutch and their monopoly on EUV machines as a result. Whoever between them is gaining access to ASML's machines will inevitably wield the most technologically advanced military in the 21st century. So, to prevent China from ever gaining access to the machines for their own chip industry and military, the United States has consistently applied pressure on the Dutch government to restrict ASML from selling their most advanced EUV machines to China. And in 2023, the Biden administration even pressured the Netherlands even further to restrict some of ASML's older, less advanced lithography machines to China. Despite China having been ASML's biggest market in 2023, accounting for about a third of its total revenue for the whole year. There are fears that if ASML is eventually blocked out from China entirely, companies will then have no other choice but to begin investing heavily into the photolithography sector and to eventually build out their own EUV machines, which could finally provide ASML with some competition. Until then, as it stands right now, no other company in the world is anywhere close to challenging ASML's dominance in this sector, and the company controls an absolute monopoly on the machines that make our entire modern world possible as a result. The latest...
Do it yourself. Go to any search engine. Ask a question. Is Winnie the Pooh, I'm sorry, Winnie the Pooh. Xi Jinping, is he running a dictatorship or a dictating government? Go to Google, go to any search engine. Use at least 3, because there's a shit ton there. But use at least 3. And the 4th one, go use X. Fucking AI search engine, and you'll be fucking amazed.
This monopoly and the long history of monopolies that have been enjoyed by the Dutch trade empire. Whether it's the control of these marvelous machines that make all of our technology possible, their vast greenhouses that nearly compete with the United States on food production, their control of the largest natural gas field in Europe, their control of the largest port in the world outside of East Asia, their vast network of internal waterways and infrastructure, or their conquest of new lands from the sea, the Dutch have proven themselves time and time again as the most overpowered country in Europe, punching far above what their own small population and small land size would otherwise suggest. And I very deeply admire them for everything they have managed to accomplish. They have completely transformed their small, swampy, flood-prone river delta into a major world power that has continually withstood the test of time well into the 21st century today that has defined human history. And will continue doing so for the foreseeable future. To me, though, I think the most impressive fact about the Dutch is just how much food they're capable of producing in their small country. They're global leaders in cheese, tomatoes, potatoes, and they somehow manage to export more beef than any other country in Europe does. If all of that stuff about the Netherlands' food production suddenly made you very hungry, you're not alone. And if you're anything like me, you might also be wondering why it still takes so much money and time to just eat more healthily. The global food supply runs more efficiently than it ever has before, but there's still
In terms of people, Norway is a pretty small country, home to only about 5.5 million individuals. To put that into perspective, Norway has fewer people than many of the world's city-states do, such as Singapore's 6 million people or Hong Kong's nearly 7.5 million people. So while small in people, Norway is very large in land. The country has about 385,000 square kilometers. 464 times larger than Singapore, despite having a fewer number of people than in either. Put another way, Norway's population size is also roughly equivalent to within its similar mountainous area than Norway. Naturally, this makes Norway one of the most sparsely populated and overall empty countries in the world, with the lowest density of people that can be found anywhere in mainland continental Europe. With the northern half of the country stretching beyond the Arctic Circle in the far north with a very thin layer of topsoil above bedrock, the land of Norway is mostly harsh, mountainous, rugged, and very cold with a short growing season, an environment that doesn't lend itself very well to sustaining large numbers of people. Only 2.2% of Norway's land is even considered arable and suitable for agriculture, one of the lowest percentages in the world and roughly equivalent to Yemen's percentage, a mountainous country in the Arabian Desert without even any rivers that's widely regarded as a failed state. This ultimately means that despite having 385,000 square kilometers of overall land, only about 7,124 square kilometers of Norway's land is suitable for agriculture, a paltry amount that is similar to the amount of arable land found in El Salvador, a country that is 16 times smaller than Norway in overall land, but which has a similar population of about 6.3 million people. Because the two countries have a similar amount of arable land that they can actually use to sustain their populations with. And then, to make matters even worse for Norway, their small amounts of arable land are scattered all throughout the south of the country in small valleys in between all of their massive mountains, which has always made the creation of large, integrated, and efficient farms in the country impossible. With its vast and wide open expanses of arable land all throughout the country, the average farm size in the United States is more than 8 times greater than that in Norway as a result. And so, American farms are more integrated, more efficient, and more productive as a result, and can simply feed many times more people. Because of these inherent disadvantages when it comes to agricultural potential, there have been expectations and assumptions made by people all throughout Norway was historically a poor country until the sudden discovery of oil changed everything in the late 1960s. It paved the way for Norway's currently well-known prosperity. But the interesting truth is that oil didn't actually make Norway rich. It just made Norway even richer than it already was beforehand. Contrary to popular belief, Norway has been a relatively wealthy country for most of its entire history, and it almost counterintuitively has to do exactly with the same geography that makes the country so terrible for agricultural production. There are other geographic factors that can determine the fate of nations beyond agricultural potential, and one of the biggest others is how easy it is to travel around the country's territory and conduct trade. Transportation across Norway by land, however, has always been very difficult. For thousands of years before modern highways and tunnels, traveling along the Norwegian west coast on foot or horse was basically impossible because of the omnipresent steep mountains and deep fjords that carved all across the landscape. But this seemingly geographic curse actually turned into one of Norway's greatest geographic blessings in disguise. Because of all the jagged fjords located all throughout the Norwegian coast, Norway is generally regarded as having by far the longest coastline anywhere in Europe, with a coastline that's more than 6.5 times longer than the United Kingdom, according to the CIA World Factbook. In fact, Norway's coastline is considered to be so enormous because of all these fjords that it's ranked as having the second longest coastline of all the countries in the entire world, remaining only behind the number 1 spot of Canada. This has always meant that as Norway coalesced into a modern nation-state, its small population was always scattered in small clusters all throughout the mountains and the fjords, separated from one another across land. Not too unlike other mountainous societies like Afghanistan or Persia. But unlike those societies deep within the interior of Eurasia, the small scattered population clusters across Norway all had easy and immediate access to the global ocean because of all of the fjords that cut deep into Norway's interior. This geography encouraged a maritime culture to develop within Norway from very early on, and the fjords granted the Norwegians the ability to rapidly travel between each other's settlements by sea. Moreover, the fjords enabled easy access for traders to penetrate deep into the country's interior and get close to one of Norway's greatest natural assets, its huge forests and lumber resources. Norway has never had the largest forest in Europe. It's beaten out by many other countries with larger ones like Russia, Finland, Sweden, and even France. But for centuries, all throughout the age of sail, before the development of railroads unlocked Russia's lumber potential, Norway's lumber industry was the biggest in Europe because of how much more relatively easier it was to access their forests in the interior, through the fjords, and export it to markets. Norway's lumber could be felled within the interior, then cheaply and efficiently dumped into rivers and floated downstream toward the settlements and sawmills along the fjords, where sawmills powered by those same downhill rivers and their waterfalls would refine the lumber, and the lumber could then be cheaply exported out through the fjords and onto the global market. And so, until the later 19th century, when railroads fully unlocked the lumber potential of European countries with larger forests like Russia, Finland, and Sweden, these relative geographic advantages made
Dr.
Norway the
Mannheim,
lumber
these
powerhouse
samples
of
are
Europe for
amazing.
centuries, and the country's
But the
maritime
one
culture
I
enabled it to build out a
truly want
world-class merchant
is
fleet.
missing.
By the time that the
If
20th
you
century
won't
rolled
give
around,
me what
Norway
I want,
already had the 4th
Europe
largest
no
merchant
peace
marine
to
fleet
me.
in the entire world. The nature of Norway's well-connected but spread out and
Or
low density
perhaps
also
you
encouraged
are.
two things. One, communities collaborated with each other by fuel routes, which led to a common identity for mountainous geography. Norway's small population clusters learned early on to cooperate together on a sources of nature. The entire Norwegian account cooperated together in the construction of ships that would fly its ownership.
Oh,
Never really developed the same way that they did elsewhere in places like
what the?
Norway was actually already well for by the 1850s, Norway's GDP per capita was already higher than basically the entirety of its country, exceeding that of Bulgaria, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. And by the 1880s, Norway's GDP per capita was almost 7 euros, according to Spain, Greece, while by the 19th century, it was already the wealthiest country on average in Europe, a huge part of the reason why Norway's economy accelerated so rapidly between 1970 and 1990.
Norway, therefore, is one of the highest hydroelectric power potentials of any country in the world. And beginning in 1905, they started allowing outside foreign companies with higher levels of expertise to start building modern hydroelectric dams to unlock their potential.
What? Fuck you. Ah!
Norway is the seventh largest producer of hydropower in the world as of 2024. The total generation rate that is more than half of the United States, while for only 1/67th of the American population. The harnessing of Norway's hydropower is the incentive, providing the country with its first major as a native country rapidly industrialized once upon a time. By 1920, Norway was consuming more electricity per capita than any other country in the world. More than two-thirds of the population already has access to electricity, double the United States. This huge amount of energy for such a small population then enabled the Norwegians to develop extremely energy-intensive areas.
Dude, what the fuck is your problem?
Hydro Corporation, which is today one of the largest aluminum companies. Norsk Hydro continues to source the vast majority of
What the hell is this deal, man?
the industry came to become dominated by the large foreign companies who came to Norway to invest in building oil. So, Norway sought to gradually wrest control over them to secure its own national control over its own resources.
Not
Norway's small
fucking
and spread out
working.
population lacked large amounts of capital and technical expertise, however, and they needed the large foreign investors to help them build out their hydroelectric and factory potential. And so, with some quick
The beautiful life
nationalization
of
of foreign
it
investors'
is moving,
assets
pick
could have
it up.
sent all of that foreign investment and expertise they needed fleeing in the future. To avoid that outcome and to still secure their own control over their own resources, Norway decided on taking a pragmatic and wrong approach to the hydro industry to directly influence their approach to the oil and gas industry decades later. Norway established rules for foreign companies with the ability to buy and include clauses that hydroelectric power stations and mines they built and funded would be turned over to the 60 to 80 years ago. Moreover, foreign companies would continue to invest in countries that would see one
Ah!
We need to kill them by their corresponding thing.
No shit, Sherlock.
They're ice, bring them near one of the frozen tubes. If they're fire, the opposite.
In a letter written by the Geological Survey of Norway in 1938,
Again? What the hell's going on? What the fuck is hitting me, man? Yeah. Yeah. Keep sailing on you
Norway's
only.
section of the North Sea actually was, because the maritime boundaries within the North Sea had been firmly or legally separated between all of the nations that surrounded it. But, luckily for Norway in 1965, appeared to get exploring and drilling themselves. The government of the UK peacefully agreed to simply divide the continental shelf beneath the North Sea based on the principle of the median line distance. The geographic line running down the center of the North Sea between the UK's land and Norway's land. Decades later, this easy calculation would go on to massively benefit Norwegians, because it took into account all of the thousands of Norway's islands just off of their western coast in determining where the
What?
16 kilometers west of the which the median line
Fuck away from me!
only 50% of it. Norwegian government began granting exploration licenses. But it wasn't considered economically viable at the time. Would it be until the 1990s, 3 decades later, that Norway would finally begin operation? Well, finally, just before Christmas Day, Norway delivered the Norwegian government the greatest Christmas presentation of the Here's what they had discovered, the fiscal sea, which turned out to be one of the largest offshore oil anywhere.
Damn it, dude!
To know that it marks an evolution.
What the fuck is... Nothing on... What the fuck is...
I figured it out. Kill the corresponding thing while you're near the little, whatever you want to call them.
Go the white on white, the red on red.
Yeah, basically.
Bring a red to this.
But you need to be next to the little diffuser things, I guess you
You
can call it.
got to be in the circle. Some of them already have hearts,
Yeah,
so
pretty
the
much.
ones that already have hearts in it, don't worry about it.
Coming back.
Good guy.
Fire guy right by me. He's stopping.
Over.
Fuck away from me! Fuck the old guy. You're aiming at me. Fuck.
Fire guy all the way in the back.
Bring him over here.
I want to go down.
Red. Come on. Come over to the empty red.
Oh, what the fuck, man?
Come on. Come over here.
25% of their oil imports, up against Norway's share of 9.4% of their oil imports. And by this point, with billions of dollars a year gushing into the Norwegian economy, Norway had already effectively become a petrostate, the only one in Europe other than Russia. In 2021, oil and gas made up roughly 21% of the entire Norwegian GDP and made up a whopping 51% of all of Norway's exports by value. But Norway never actually evolved into the usual petrostate stereotypes of corruption and authoritarianism for several notable reasons that set it notably apart from the others. While there is no universally agreed upon definition of what actually constitutes a petrostate, the most general definitions revolve around countries whose economies are very heavily dependent upon the extractions and exporting of oil and gas to the point where without those industries, their economies could face collapse. 25 countries around the world, spanning South America, Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and Asia, usually come to mind as the world's most classic examples of petrostates. Out of all 25 of them, every single one are considered by the Economist Democracy Index to be either authoritarian regimes or hybrid regimes, except for only two of them, Indonesia and Norway. But Norway stands out above all of the rest, ahead of even Indonesia, because the same index from The Economist literally ranks Norway as the single most democratic, free, and egalitarian society on the face of the earth, which puts its status as a petrostate into an extremely stark contrast with the likes of Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, and Venezuela, which are all among the most heavily authoritarian and corrupt states in the world. And a big part of the reason why an abundance of oil and gas resources didn't turn Norway into a heavily authoritarian and corrupt state like most of the other petrostates is because of the country's geography, history, and forward-looking policies that their government enacted from early on. When Norway discovered oil, the country already had a long culture of communal ownership of natural resources going back centuries to the lumber and hydro industries. The country was already wealthy, industrialized, highly developed, and had a stable, functioning democracy where wealth and power were each already highly decentralized. Democratic institutions and communal ownership of resources were already strongly ingrained within the fabric of Norwegian society as a result, which is an incredibly stark contrast to just about every single other country that discovered discovered enormous oil and gas wealth. Saudi Arabia discovered its oil wealth when it was ruled by a warlord who had established an absolute monarchy and had already centralized power fully around himself. And so the oil wealth only further cemented the monarchy's power. Oil was similarly discovered in Iran while the country was ruled by an autocratic monarchy, and the keys to the oil wealth were inherited by the still autocratic Islamic Revolution after 1979. Oil was discovered within Russia during the Tsarist period, and the keys to the oil wealth were inherited by the still autocratic Soviets, and then further inherited by the modern Putinist regime. Oil was discovered in Venezuela during the autocratic military dictatorship of Juan Vicente Gomez, while the oil industries in Syria, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, and all across Africa were basically handed over directly from autocratic European colonial administrations to autocratic dictatorships that immediately or very quickly took over in their place. Of all the countries to have ever discovered enormous oil and gas wealth, only a handful have ever done so while already being wealthy, politically independent, and with stable traditions of democracy and low levels of inequality. And the only one with a very small population to have ever done so has been Norway. Norway was thus better prepared to handle the sudden influx of oil and gas wealth than most others have been. But it still initially caused the Norwegian economy to become rapidly undiversified and dependent on oil and gas anyway. Throughout the 1970s and early 80s, when the price of oil was high, the oil-dependent Norwegian economy was booming. But then in 1986, the price of oil suddenly collapsed, and with it, Norway's heavily oil-dependent economy suffered its first oil-induced recession. Over the past 6 decades of history, going back to 1960, the Norwegian economy has only ever shrunk on 3 occasions. In 2020, during the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, in 2009, during the depths of the Great Financial Crisis, and in 1988, back during the depths of this oil recession. But the Norwegian government learned a valuable lesson from this recession in the 1980s. It needed to diversify itself away from the unpredictable ebbs and flows in the oil market. And so, just a couple years later in 1990, the Norwegian state, with its long history of communal ownership of resources and democratic institutions, had the foresight and the capability to establish the Pension Fund Global, otherwise known as the so-called Oil Fund. The fund was established as a communal sovereign wealth fund owned by the Norwegian state and people, into which the surplus revenues from the state-owned oil company Equinor and taxes on the oil and gas industry would be invested into for the benefit of Norway's future generations, and to diversify the government and economy away from oil and gas. Strict rules and guidelines were established around the fund's operations. It would invest heavily into global stock markets and real estate in order to diversify away from the Norwegian economy. And very strict rules were set into place that no more than 3% of the fund's assets could be withdrawn in any given year, which not only enabled the fund to continue growing and compounding with time, but also disallowed the abuse of the fund's assets by Norwegian politicians, who would otherwise be tempted into promising to lavishly spend the oil wealth today at the expense of tomorrow in order to get themselves elected. A hallmark of the more autocratic petrostates, where unpopular regimes or dictators spend the oil wealth lavishly on their people as a sort of bargain for them to put up with their authoritarianism. And as the Norwegian oil and gas industry continued growing and more wealth was deposited into the oil fund, and as the global economy continued growing alongside it, and as withdrawals were capped at no more than 3% per year, the Norwegian oil fund steadily evolved from nothing in 1990 into the absolute behemoth that it is today. Currently, the fund is by far the largest sovereign wealth fund in the entire world. Its current net assets exceed more than $1.5 trillion US, and the fund owns an estimated 1.5% of all the shares of all the more than 9,000 publicly traded companies in the world, and is the global stock market's single largest investor today, making the fund the world's biggest stock market whale. This is despite the fact that the Norwegian economy itself only represents about 0.5% of the entire global economy, and despite the fact that the Norwegian population only represents about 0.07% of the worldwide human population. And yet, they own 1.5% of the global stock market. The oil fund is currently so massive relative to Norway's small population that it's worth approximately $275,000 per Norwegian citizen, if they decided to ever cash it all out. And it's already reached a point where the fund's conservatively capped 3% withdrawal rate per year can safely provide for about 20% of the entire Norwegian government's annual budget in perpetuity, giving Norway the ability to rely less on the unpredictable fluctuations of oil and gas price revenue to continue funding their government operations and shielding the country from future oil price collapses. Now, back to Norway's oil and gas industry. The country controls the 20th largest proven reserves of oil and the 21st largest proven reserves of natural gas, which have granted Norway the ability to become the world's 13th largest oil producer and the 9th largest gas producer, representing about 2% of worldwide oil demand and 3% of worldwide gas demand. But Norway's fairly modest shares of worldwide oil and gas reserves and production are each absolutely dwarfed by Norway's massively outsized shares of worldwide oil and gas exports. Despite only being the 13th largest oil producer and only having the 20th largest reserves, Norway is currently the world's 8th largest oil exporter and is fast approaching the exports of Kuwait in 7th place, despite Kuwait having 12.5 times more oil reserves than Norway and 50% higher oil production. And it's even more lopsided when it comes to natural gas, where, despite only being the 9th largest producer and only having the 21st largest reserves, Norway is the 4th largest global exporter anyway, only just barely behind the big three of the global gas market: the United States, Russia, and Qatar, the latter of which the Norwegians are rapidly approaching a takeover of to become one of the new top 3 in the global gas industry. Now, Norway has been able to achieve this massively outsized presence in its share of global oil and gas exports due to several different factors. The first of which is, of course, its close proximity to the energy-hungry European Union and its ability to construct subsea pipelines directly from source to consumer. The next factor is Norway's own small population that naturally has a lower energy demand than countries with similar reserves but much larger populations, like Angola, Ecuador, and Azerbaijan. While the third and arguably biggest factor is a result of Norway's own geography and strategically chosen policies. Norway produces enough renewable hydropower through all of its rivers and dams to power 95% of the country's electricity demand. And in addition to having the largest hydro potential in Europe, the country also has one of the largest wind potentials as well. The coasts around Norway and the mountains that run along the country's spine are among the windiest locations to be found on a continent that is generally not a very windy place. So, in addition to having the 7th largest installed hydroelectric capacity in the world, Norway already has the 18th largest installed wind capacity in the world as well, and has a massively untapped potential here that is only just starting to grow. So, in addition to having pretty large amounts of oil and gas, the country also has huge amounts of renewable energy potential as well, and they've been using that potential to their strategic advantage. They effectively keep all of their renewable hydro and wind resources in-house to meet their own energy demands indefinitely, which has freed them up to sell most of their oil and gas resources that they don't really need to outsiders abroad, and especially to the energy-hungry EU directly next door. And in addition to harnessing their local hydro, wind, and even geothermal potential to effectively turn their entire electric grid into 100% domestically produced renewables, they're also reducing the amount of fossil fuels their country consumes even further by offering generous tax and financial incentives to their citizens to adopt fully electric vehicles or EVs as well. As a result, a whopping 88% of all new car sales in Norway across 2022 were EVs, which is by far the highest market share that EVs have yet achieved in any country in the world today. And since these pro-EV policies have been being pursued within Norway for a long time now, nearly 1 in every 3 vehicles on Norwegian roads are already EVs that don't consume any oil and are powered instead by the state's domestic and renewable hydro, wind, and geothermal resources. And for Norway, this is about far more than simply reducing emissions and combating climate change. It's also about national security and financial power. The more that the Norwegian electricity grid became powered by renewable sources from within Norway, the more secure the country became from having to rely on foreign energy imports and supply chains. And the more of their own oil and gas resources they could sell abroad, and the more cash they could plow into their sovereign wealth fund to diversify their economy further away from oil. And the more EVs that get adopted within the country that can be indefinitely powered by their domestic renewable sources, then the even more of their domestic oil resources they won't need and can sell abroad as well to continue plowing even more money into the sovereign wealth fund to diversify even more away from oil. It is a cascading strategy that has been diligently followed in Norway for decades that is steadily transforming the country into one of, if not the, most powerful and influential states in Europe. It is thus Norway's unique 21st century philosophy and doctrine that that its oil and gas resources are to be produced and sold to foreigners, while its renewable resources are to be harnessed and provided for the needs of the Norwegian people. This clever and unique strategy has set them up to be capable of selling and exporting virtually all of the oil and gas that they produce, while simultaneously being completely energy independent at the same time, which is how Norway's modest global oil and gas reserves and production levels take up so much more of the world's total exports, and how the country has gotten so spectacularly wealthy in the process.
What the fuck?
The results of all of this prudence and decades of forward-looking strategic thinking all culminated in 2022 after the Russians decided to invade Ukraine. In the aftermath of triggering the biggest war in Europe since World War II, the European Union decided to begin shutting down their previously massive imports of Russian oil and gas in order to deny the Kremlin its primary source of funding for their war machine attempting to overrun Ukraine. But of course, the EU had to quickly find somebody else to begin replacing Russia's previously large shares of 25% of their oil imports and 45% of their gas imports. And Norway, with its big oil and gas resources right nearby and its friendly relations, was the best positioned country in the world to take advantage of the situation and fill in the demand. Consequently, exports of Norwegian oil by tankers, gas through pipelines, and even liquefied gas or LNG by tankers all began surging towards the EU market to replace the Russians, with Norway's overall share of EU oil imports rising from 9.5% just before the war to 13.3% in the first quarter of 2023. Which makes Norway currently the EU's single largest provider of oil. Norway's share of the EU's imported piped gas also skyrocketed upwards from 38.1% just before the war to a whopping 46.1% in the first quarter of 2023, while Norway's share of the EU's imported LNG rose from basically nothing just before the invasion to 6.6% in Q1 of 2023. The bloc's fifth largest provider of LNG now overall. And at the same time as Norway's oil and gas export volumes to a suddenly desperate EU were rapidly rising, the global prices of oil and gas were each rapidly rising right alongside them. The result of this situation caused by Russia has been an absolute financial bonanza for the Norwegians, the likes of which has never before been seen. The country pulled in a whopping $112.3 billion in revenue from their oil and gas industry in 2022 alone, and then immediately shattered that record with another $131 billion in oil and gas revenue across 2023, compared to a relatively paltry $29 billion in oil and gas revenue that they earned before the war and the energy crisis in 2021. Norway's oil and gas revenue in 2023 alone was roughly equivalent to the entire collective GDP of Slovakia, and they've been utilizing their sudden windfall very wisely. They have invested enormous amounts of it into the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and tens of billions of dollars more are being invested to explore for even further untapped oil and gas deposits that could be found within Norway's far northern Barents Sea that still remains largely unexplored. More pipelines are being built to Europe to expand their export capacity even further, and to replace the Russians' previous market share even further. Norway's increasing displacement of Russia in the European energy market was perhaps best symbolized in September of 2022. On the 27th of that month, a series of bombs detonated underwater, destroying sections of the Nord Stream 1 and 2 natural gas pipelines that connected German factories and homes directly to Russia's huge natural gas fields in Siberia. Both pipelines were rendered completely inoperable by the sabotage, destroying Russia's ability to directly export gas to Germany. And then, the very next day afterwards, the Norwegians and the Poles inaugurated the opening of the Baltic Pipe, Norway's brand new gas pipeline to Poland that will replace all of the roughly 60% of Poland's natural gas imports that had been coming from Russia with Norwegian gas instead. Norway has therefore emerged in the 2020s as the European Union's largest single supplier of energy, and in the future it isn't likely to be limited to oil and gas exports either. In the future, as climate change progresses, it's expected that precipitation levels in Scandinavia will actually increase further than what they're like today, which will mean that even more water will be feeding into Norway's rivers that cascade down the mountains toward the west coast. While Norway's still largely untapped wind potential is expected to be expanded to make the country a global leader in wind energy as well. Norway likely won't need all of this excess renewable hydro and wind power for just itself in the future. And so the possibility has already been raised of building out transmission lines from Norway to the EU so that the Norwegians can export their hydro and wind-sourced energy to Europe in addition to their oil and gas resources. And besides transforming into Europe's most significant energy province, Norway will also likely become one of Europe's and the Western world's largest sources of mineral and rare earth might as well. It's well known by now that the global push toward a green energy transition, which is being largely spearheaded by European economies, will require vast amounts of metals and rare earth elements to keep itself going. Rare earths especially are vital materials that are necessary for EV batteries, smartphones, wind turbines, digital cameras, hard drives, and tons of other things that are vital for powering modern 21st century life and growth. Unfortunately, though, for Europe and the Western world, the vast majority of the world's proven rare earth reserves are currently dominated by China. China conducts an overwhelming 63% of all the rare earth mining in the world, which is more than every other country combined. And China conducts an even more overwhelming 85% of all the world's rare earth processing. China controls roughly a third of the planet's proven rare earth reserves, followed up by Vietnam, Russia, and Brazil. After which, there's a huge gap before Australia comes next, lagging far behind any of the top four. And China has already been weaponizing its dominance over these rare earth resources as well, in a similar way to how Russia weaponizes its dominance over oil and gas. In July of 2023, China declared that they were introducing new export restrictions on two metals that are critical for the manufacturing of semiconductors, gallium and germanium, in retaliation to U.S. economic sanctions on China's semiconductor industry. China currently produces 98% of the world's gallium and 68% of the world's germanium. So, if China decides you can't have them, you effectively just can't. And although neither gallium nor germanium are rare earth metals, they are nonetheless also still critical to powering modern digital life. And so, China's export restrictions on them were meant as a clear threat that additional metals and minerals that China dominates could become restricted in the future as well. But it was around that same time that a company called Norge Mining in Norway suddenly made a surprise announcement in June of 2023. They had just about out of nowhere discovered by far the largest reserve of phosphate rock ever found in the world. And it was just sitting there in southern Norway this whole time. The company has since estimated that this deposit contains around 70 billion tons of economically recoverable phosphate, which literally in a flash doubled the entire world's previously proven reserves of phosphate that had sat at 71 billion tons beforehand. Put another way, this recent Norwegian discovery is so vast that it can supply the entire world's demand for phosphate all on its own for the next half a century to come. And it completely undermines the previous dominance over phosphate that was up to then enjoyed by Morocco, who controls an estimated 50 billion tons of the resource that equaled about 70% of the world's proven reserves before June of 2023, and then was cut down a size by half to only about 35% of the world's proven reserves after the discovery in Norway. Prior to Norway's gigantic discovery, it was Morocco and China who were the largest producers of phosphates, and they dominated the global market for it. Phosphates are really important because they're a critical component used in fertilizer and global food chains. And in smaller quantities, they're also similarly used to produce digital devices and EV batteries. And Norge Mining still isn't finished either. They believe that their huge phosphate discovery in southern Norway also contains huge amounts of metals like titanium and vanadium as well. Metals that are vital for the construction of everything from aircraft to computers and submarines and more. At the moment, the production of both metals are dominated by China, who produces roughly 36% of the world's titanium and more than half of the world's vanadium, while vanadium's production is further 99% dominated by the BRICS countries, with virtually all of the world's production of the metal happening in China, Russia, South Africa, and Brazil. This has meant that for a very long time, the US and the EU have each had to rely on geopolitically tenuous supply chains for their access to these raw materials that are vital to continue building airplanes and submarines and computers. And China's export restrictions on germanium and gallium show that China could, in the future, decide on introducing even harsher export restrictions on titanium and vanadium as well. Norway's probable massive amounts of both titanium and vanadium could end up granting Europe and the West their strategic autonomy from China, if Norge Mining delivers, while Norway is also now set to become the world's newest largest source of phosphates. This ultimately means that, in addition to becoming Europe's largest source of oil and gas and a major source of renewable energy, Norway is also primed to become Europe's largest source of many of the rare earth materials that are crucial for modern technologies, the green energy transition, and agriculture. And Norway is completely undermining the previous dominance in all of these industries in Europe that have previously been enjoyed by more autocratic powers like Russia and China. Norway is providing the Europeans with the ability to rely more on the most democratic country in the world for their raw materials, and less on their historically large autocratic providers like Russia, Algeria, Libya, Azerbaijan, and the Gulf states. Which means that Norway is probably only going to continue growing richer and richer by expanding their sovereign wealth fund even further, to dominate more of the global stock and bond markets while expanding its tax incentives to completely electrify their vehicles and grid even further so that they can keep selling more oil and gas to Europe to continue fueling their sovereign wealth fund. Norway has basically discovered the geopolitical equivalent of the infinite money village, and they've wisely set themselves up for generations of prosperity for every Norwegian citizen for years to come. Now, there's a lot of data that goes into producing these kinds of videos, whether it's showing how Norway and Russia compete for the oil and gas market in Europe, what Norway's wind and hydroelectric potentials look like, how Norway's small population stacks up against larger city-states, or showing how China dominates the rare earth metals industry. The ability to visualize raw data like this on the map is exactly what makes learning this stuff so fascinating to me. And it's why the Exploring Data Visually course is one of my favorite courses that I've ever taken with this video sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant is a STEM learning platform that helps you learn by actually doing. They don't just give you a mountain of text and expect you to remember everything you read. They use interactive exercises to teach you the intuitive principles, then build these principles upon each other so that you can genuinely understand complex subjects like data visualization and analysis, statistics, computer science, astrophysics, and tons of others. They really know how to teach for results, which is why Brilliant is perfect for the kind of person who wants to learn because they love learning, not because they're being forced to. And best of all, with their mobile app and smaller bite-sized course chunks, it's really possible to fit learning on Brilliant into any schedule, no matter how busy your day-to-day activities might be. So, if you're the type of person who loves learning new, fascinating things, you can try out Brilliant for free for a full 30 days by clicking the button that's here on your screen right now, or by following the link that's down below in the description at brilliant.org/real-life-lore. And the first 200 of you to do so will also get 20% off of Brilliant's annual subscription as well. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Phoenix is one of America's and the world's most peculiar large cities today. If you arrive in the city during the summer when the temperature is routinely higher than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, you'll be simultaneously struck with a sense of wonder and confusion as to how and why so many people have managed to live here in this objectively hostile environment. And just like a city you settle in Sid Meier's civilization during the late game in an undesirable area that nobody's picked yet, Phoenix is one of the real world's most recently settled major cities. Only a little more than 80 years ago now, back in 1940, Phoenix was still a fairly small, sleepy town in Arizona with just a tad more than 65,000 residents. It didn't even rank in the top 100 largest U.S. cities back then, and it barely even registered as a blip in the general consciousness of most Americans, let alone the rest of the world. The town had only been initially settled a bit more than 70 years before 1940, back in 1867. Which means that the time between Phoenix being initially settled and growing into this small town of 65,000 is about the same length of time as from 1940 to today. But over Phoenix's second time period of 80 years from 1940 to today, over the span of just a single lifetime, Phoenix evolved from that small, dusty town in the desert that nobody had ever heard of into a sprawling urban metropolis home to nearly 5 million people that ranks as the 5th largest city in all of America now, having surpassed the city limits population of Philadelphia in 2020 to clinch its position in the top 5 biggest U.S. cities. In terms of city limits population in America, Phoenix is now only overshadowed by the likes of Houston, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. And it's still growing at a faster pace than any of those other larger cities. Phoenix has since become one of the most quintessential examples of American suburban sprawl, with seemingly endless rows of single-family homes spilling out beyond the urban core into the surrounding flat desert landscape. By 2007, roughly 1 acre of desert land around Phoenix was being developed into residential real estate every single hour. And Phoenix is still one of the top 10 fastest growing metropolitan areas in the country in the 2020s, as Americans from all across the rest of the country are being pulled to the region for Arizona's low taxes, relatively low cost of living compared to states like California, Phoenix's booming economy and plentiful jobs, the year-round sunshine, and the beautiful winters. But hardly anyone back in the early 20th century, back when Phoenix was still just that small, dusty town, could have ever predicted this meteoric rise over the span of the 8 decades that followed after 1940. Because Phoenix exists within a geographically unlikely place for such a massive urban population to have ever arisen in. It's in the middle of a valley within the hot and arid Sonoran Desert that lacks major nearby water resources. The Gila River, a tributary of the much larger Colorado River, passes through the area, but its flow is very small at only about 7 cubic meters per second on average, which is only about a tenth of the flow of the Rio Grande that runs through New Mexico and forms the border between Texas and Mexico. The Gila River is more of a stream in comparison, so humanity had to spend decades inefficiently diverting more and more water to the area from elsewhere to continue fueling and sustaining all of the growth. In Phoenix today, you'll see a landscape that's dotted with lush green golf courses, farms, and swimming pools cast against a backdrop of dry deserts and rocks that surround them. It probably won't come as a surprise to you then that despite having less than half of the population of New York City today, the Phoenix metropolitan area consumes more than twice the amount of water as New York does. And in the age of climate change, Phoenix's future water supply and habitability are each coming increasingly into open question now. This last summer in 2023 broke the all-time record in Phoenix's history for the highest number of days to reach more than 110 degrees Fahrenheit, or 43 degrees Celsius. 54 solid days of them. While one of those days broke the all-time high single-day record in the city of 113 degrees Fahrenheit, or 45 degrees Celsius. 2023 was Phoenix's hottest year ever on record, after breaking the previous record that was only set in 2021. And the previous record before that was only set in 2020. And as the temperatures in Phoenix are increasing, the city's precious water supplies are also beginning to decrease, with cuts already being made to both of Arizona's primary water sources, the Colorado River and the state's own groundwater. While Phoenix announced just last year that for the first time ever, they'll be freezing certain new residential building permits over a concern of the area's diminishing water supply. There is a real fear emerging that this could be the beginning of the end of Phoenix's past 80 years worth of explosive and limitless suburban growth across the desert, and that the chickens are finally coming home to roost in Phoenix. Peggy Hill herself probably summed up the cultural attitude towards Phoenix best during this episode of King the Hill after stepping outside in the city during a 111 degree Fahrenheit day.
This city should not exist. It is a monument to man's arrogance.
The wisdom of having established a nearly 5 million person metropolitan area in the middle of the Sonoran Desert is being criticized louder with every passing year. And the next 80 years of Phoenix's history are shaping up to look very different than how the past 80 years went. And in order to understand where the city is going, if this is all really the end of Phoenix as we know it, and how Phoenix managed to get so huge in spite of its desert environment it became the so-called monument to man's arrogance in the first place, it helps to begin with how Phoenix and Arizona all came to be in the first place. Modern Arizona and the valley where Phoenix would one day arise in was sparsely inhabited by indigenous Americans for thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans. The pre-Columbian Hohokam people inhabited the area in the valley for nearly 1,000 years and were the first to recognize the area's potential for agriculture despite its arid environment. They developed a series of complex canals around the Gila and Salt rivers in the area that made agriculture possible before mysteriously disappearing sometime around 1450. It wasn't too long after that the first Europeans began to arrive in the area in the 16th century. And then all of modern-day Arizona and the rest of the American Southwest steadily fell under the control of the colonial Spanish Empire, and was later inherited by the independent state of Mexico in the 19th century. But the modern American Southwest was always a sparsely populated fringe territory on the frontiers of their empire. By the 1840s, only about 80,000 people lived across all of the Mexican territories that would eventually become Arizona, New Mexico, California, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. And 3/4 of all of them just lived in modern-day New Mexico. In 1846, the United States declared war on Mexico and conquered all of these lands, and then purchased a bit more land in southern Arizona and New Mexico with the Gadsden Purchase in 1854, which was the event that brought all of modern-day Arizona and New Mexico both under American control. Arizona and New Mexico were then each born as effectively twin territories of the United States that have always ever since made up the geographic core of the American Southwest region. Both have very comparable geographic sizes and shapes, and both have very similar climates and topographies. And both would be jointly admitted into the Union as the final states in the continental U.S. at about the same time in 1912. New Mexico in January of that year, and Arizona the following month in February. Despite their similarities, however, both states would end up having radically different demographic destinies across the 20th and 21st centuries, with Arizona's current population in 2024 estimated to be at about 7.5 million people. New Mexico's lagging far behind it at only a bit more than 2.1 million people.
But interestingly, back at the time in 1912, New Mexico was the one who entered as a state with a larger population. Remember that 3/4 of the Mexicans who lived across all of this territory that would be conquered by the United States in 1846 all just lived in modern-day New Mexico, which is part of why this territory and state became called New Mexico in the first place. In 1912, New Mexico entered the United States with a population of 330,000 people, compared to Arizona's meager 217,000 people. And New Mexico would continue remaining the more populous of the two for decades until after the Second World War, when Arizona and Phoenix would each begin their era of rapid, runaway, explosive growth that would quickly eclipse New Mexico's growth in the process. But even before Arizona's rapid population boom began in the second half of the 20th century, the seeds were already being sown for the state's current debilitating water crisis. In 1862, before Phoenix was even settled, the United States federal government passed the first of the Homestead Acts, designed to encourage settlers colonizing and inhabiting the newly acquired desolate and empty west of the country. The act promised any settler who moved west 160 acres of free land, if they agreed to live on the land for a period of at least 5 years, and improve it through cultivation. Even more land was offered up to settlers later at a lower price if the settlers agreed to begin farming it. 10% of all the land in the entire United States was given away to Western settlers for free under these acts. But in the arid southwest of the country in Southern California and in the Arizona and New Mexico territories, where water was scarce and where irrigation infrastructure hardly existed, the ability for settlers to actually farm and cultivate the land provided to them proved very difficult. To try and resolve this issue in 1902, the United States federal government then passed the Reclamation Act, which was designed to fund extensive irrigation projects all across the American West to supposedly reclaim the land there for agriculture and civilization. The plan was for the government to sell land in the West and then use the proceeds from that land to fund the irrigation projects that would better the land and increase the land's value, enabling them to continue selling the land for ever higher prices and enabling them to fund more and more grandiose irrigation projects as time went on. Virtually every major river in the American West was dammed under this act, the largest western river. Extensively the Hoover Dam, the Glen Canyon, bringing America's first massive reservoirs in the desert like these were created and rivers were diverted to artificially bring abundant water supplies to Western settlers' farms. And so, with their free or cheap land in a year-round warm climate that enabled a longer growing season than in the rest of the country, and backed up with subsidized low federal price guarantees on their water supply, the early farmers in Arizona and the rest of the Southwest did what anyone else in their position would do, and simply began growing crops and raising livestock that required warm climates and high amounts of water, like citrus, cotton, nuts, and alfalfa, to feed their growing herds of cattle and dairy products, with little care as to where the water was actually coming from. This is why, still today in the 2020s, agriculture continues to be a booming business across the American Southwest, and why a whopping 72% of Arizona's water consumption in 2024 is still devoted to the state's agricultural sector. But establishing vast commercial farming enterprises across the Southwest's deserts wasn't the only short-sighted decision that the early planners in the American Southwest made. In 1922, the 7 states that share the Colorado River Basin area came together to negotiate what would become known as the Colorado River Compact, regulating all of their access to the river's water. The Colorado is by far the largest river that can be found in the American Southwest, with a water discharge rate that's comparable to the Hudson running through New York, and that has more than 9 times the water discharge rate of the Rio Grande that begins in New Mexico, and flows along the Mexico-Texas border. The Colorado River is fed by the huge amount of snow melt up in the Rocky Mountains, that then flows southwest towards the river's delta in the Sea of Cortez, with the watershed extending across Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Southern California. The 1922 compact between these 7 states estimated that the average annual flow down the river was approximately 16 acre-foot being a unit of measurement that imagines an acre of land covered by 1 foot of water. Essentially, an American football field that's covered with 1 foot of water. The compact then allotted 7.5 million acre-feet of water per year from the Colorado River upper 4 states, and an equal 7.5 million acre-feet of water per year allotted to the lower 3 states, divided 58.7% to California, 37.3% to Arizona, and just 4% to Nevada, while the remaining 1.5 million acre-feet of water per year was allotted to Mexico furthest downstream. with New Mexico's annual allotment from the Colorado River in the upper basin states coming out to just 11.25%, or 0.84 million acre-feet of water a year. They were entitled to significantly less water from the Colorado River than Arizona was. We got 37.3% of the lower basin state supply, which came out to 2.8 million acre-feet of water a year, more than 3 times the amount of water as New Mexico got from the river. And another part of the reason why Arizona's population took off way more than New Mexico's ever did. But a major problem with this 1922 compact was that it grossly overestimated the actual usual flows of water through the Colorado River. Their estimate for 16.5 million acre-feet of water a year through the river was based on only limited studies of the river between just 1905 and 1922, a period that many environmental scientists now believe included abnormally high levels of precipitation that abnormally increased the river's flow higher than usual. Current estimates of the river's true average flow, with more than a century's worth of data, suggests something more like 13.2 million acre-feet of water a year is the true historical average, which means that for decades now, the 7 compact states of Mexico have been pulling more water out from the river into its artificial reservoirs like Lake Mead and Lake Powell than can be actually naturally replaced. And this issue of locked-in overuse on the river has so far never been significantly amended. Moreover, legal water rights in the western U.S. were treated very differently than in the eastern U.S. Water rights are equal and more valuable, however. Established a hierarchy
Oh, this is fine.
continue holding their rights until they stop using the water. The settlers and farmers who came to the Southwest in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were the ones who acquired most of these senior water rights early on. And they were only incentivized by the system to continue guzzling all of their water from the rivers, even if they didn't actually need it. Because if they stopped using all the water they were allowed to, they'd just lose their rights to it. And the farmers would continue holding their senior rights and experiencing the water shortages in favor of anybody who came to the area after them with low seniority. Like the millions upon millions of people that have settled in southwestern cities like Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Tucson. People who came up with these laws in the Southwest a century ago, of course, were working with data, and they didn't have to enforce it. There was no way they could ever predict the rights of huge metropolitan areas like Phoenix in the future that would greatly compete with the farmers in the area for access to water. Nor could they have predicted the onset of significant climate change and its effects in the later 20th and early 21st centuries that would reduce the supply of water in the Colorado River even further. Estimates have shown that as the region's climate has warmed, the snowpack that feeds the river in the Rocky Mountains has decreased in size, while evaporation rates within the river have increased, which collectively contributed to the river's flow decreasing by approximately 10% just between 2000 and 2021. All the while, as the states continue to pull more water from the river than they probably should have been, based on faulty and outdated century-old information. And all as the legal prior appropriation doctrine has incentivized the inefficient system to continue. And all as millions of people have migrated to the region to add even further demands on the already stressed water supply. So by the time that Phoenix was that small town of 65,000 residents in 1940, the area was already consuming a lot of water to feed all the farms that had developed in the region. And agriculture had become the desert state's dominant industry. America was geoengineering green miracles in the desert. And then, following the conclusion of the Second World War after 1945, Phoenix's population really began to start taking off due to multiple compounding factors that steadily built on top of one another. The invention of the portable air conditioner, the window unit, in 1945 proved to be a revolutionary development and enabled air conditioning to become much more ubiquitous than it had ever been beforehand. This was the key development that opened up the era of mass migration and settlement to Arizona and the rest of the American Southwest. Since cheap and easy-to-install air conditioners made living in the state more tolerable and comfortable during the debilitatingly hot months of the summer. Cheap air conditioning enabled land developers all around Phoenix to finally start taking advantage of the seemingly endless, sprawling, flat land around the city's center and the valley. Water from below-ground aquifers and from the Colorado River irrigation projects provided them with everything else they needed. Tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of cheaply built single-family were built radiating all around enormous flat land surrounding Phoenix and the low costs of housing combined with Arizona's low taxes and growing reputation as a retirement destination with beautiful winter weather and now tolerable summers made possible by air conditioning and the burgeoning baby boomer population all led to the genesis of Phoenix's population explosion in the 1950s. For the last decade in 1949, Phoenix experienced more new population than it did over a three-decade period beforehand between 1914 and 1946. And the city's population grew by nearly 74% within only 10 years. Every single decade since then, the city has continued seeing double-digit percentage growth rates, with particularly huge surges in the 1970s and in the 1980s. And as the urban and suburban populations of Phoenix grew, its new population base and growing talent pool began attracting the interest of major outside companies as a new location to set up their operations or even headquarters in. Phoenix today is a major center of the modern high-tech industry. And all of that began with Motorola's decision to take a chance on Phoenix all the way back in 1948, when they built a brand new R&D center in the city. Motorola was encouraged to do so because of Arizona's low taxes and with their parallel operations established nearby in Southern California, and this really became Arizona had to continued population growth that their twin New Mexico simply didn't have. Their close proximity to the mega region that became Southern California, anchored by Los Angeles and San Diego. Phoenix is only about a 6-hour drive away from Los Angeles, while the biggest city that ever developed in New Mexico, Albuquerque, is significantly more remote from other large metropolitan areas. Denver is a 7-hour drive away from Albuquerque, and Denver is substantially smaller than Southern California. SoCal for Albuquerque because exist. And it's 9 to 10 hours away. So, Phoenix was able to have close geographic proximity to Southern California by offering lower taxes, lower regulations, and lower prices to lure businesses, jobs, and ultimately people away from Southern California in a way that Albuquerque and New Mexico were simply never able to match with Texas or other companies would begin following suit, but the largest of all of them, up until the 2020s, would end up being Intel in 1979. And they selected a suburb of Phoenix called Chandler for the construction of a huge brand new semiconductor manufacturing facility. Over the next 40 years through to 2020, Intel would invest more than $23 billion into the construction of 4 highly advanced semiconductor foundries, or fabs, within their Chandler and later Oak facilities just south of downtown Phoenix. And so Phoenix transformed into Intel's single largest semiconductor manufacturing site within the United States. Today, more than 15,000 Intel employees work at their 2 Phoenix area campuses. And based on 2019, Intel's estimated annual economic impact on Arizona was more than $8.6 billion a year. But a very notable problem with semiconductor manufacturing is that it is an extremely water-intensive process. Water is used within semiconductor labs to clean nanoscale regions of machinery of impurities and to cool down equipment. Building out a large water reclamation facility outside of them. Because of this, Intel treats more than 9 billion gallons of water a day on their campuses here, which allows all 4 of their semiconductor labs to reuse and recycle their own industrial water supply constantly, without having to pull very much more in from Phoenix's own water supply. Still, water-intensive industrial practices like Intel semiconductor manufacturing in the region is part of why approximately 6% of Phoenix's water supply is currently devoted to industrial purposes, along with 22% to municipal use and the overwhelming majority of 72% of the rest still to agricultural use. With more huge companies like Intel that moved into the valley and all of the jobs and linked jobs that came with them, the economy of Phoenix started booming, and the population growth continued accelerating into the cheap, easy-to-develop flat land that surrounded the city's core in every direction. Decades of explosive, double-digit growth rates for Phoenix that followed after World War II contributed to the city soaring through the ranks of America's largest cities until, eventually in 1980, something astonishing happened. Phoenix became the first and so far only city from America's Mountain West region to break into the country's top 10 largest cities.
That year, the 1980 U.S. Census showed that Phoenix had accelerated more than 100 places through America's largest city rankings and had grown by more than 10 times over in the span of only 4 decades to achieve a population of about 790,000 people, edging out the city of Baltimore to take the position of America's 9th largest city. A humbling moment for the city in Maryland that had once been America's 2nd largest city for decades, behind only New York itself. But significant water issues developed for Phoenix that very same year. As hundreds of thousands of new residents moved into the area, they began competing for the state's limited water resources with the farmers who had secured most of the state's senior water rights. And so, as Phoenix's population and economy each grew from the 1950s to 1980, the city and the state's water consumption continued increasing alongside them. But, interestingly, Arizona's all-time high water consumption level happened in 1980. They managed to decrease their water consumption every single decade since then. Today, Arizona consumes less water than it actually did nearly 70 years ago, back in 1957, despite the state having more than 6 times the population and 22 times the economy. This is largely due to the fact that in 1980, as Phoenix first cracked into the top 10 biggest American cities, Arizona started to get really serious about conserving their water in the future in order to guarantee that their growth would continue in as sustainable a way as possible. The state created these water in order to golf courses and parks. While today the city is also already building another plant to treat even more wastewater for high-quality municipal drinking water by no later than 2030. And, interestingly, as the endless single-family homes radiated out across the Phoenix landscape, often transformed the previously water-guzzling farms and agricultural land in the area into suburban homes and strip malls, which were considerably less water-consuming than the farms had been, which contributed to the city saving even more water. But perhaps most importantly, the Arizona Department of Water Resources in Phoenix immediately in 1980 began enforcing the 100-year assured water supply rule. Essentially, the new rule meant that in order for developers to go ahead with new residential real estate development in Arizona, they had to prove to the state that they could secure a stable 100-year water supply to actually meet the needs of the new development far into the future. Wells accessing groundwater and aquifers beneath the valley that Phoenix sits atop of have been the primary source of the area's water supply for decades, with groundwater continuing to represent about 41% of Arizona's water supply, with another 36% coming from Arizona's take of the Colorado River, another 18% from in-state Arizona rivers like the small Gila and Salt rivers that cut across Phoenix, while the remaining 5% comes from reclaimed water. And again, it's important to remember that by sector, only 22% of Arizona's water consumption is currently being allotted to municipal and residential use. Only 6% is being allotted to industrial use, and a whopping 72% of it is still being allotted to agricultural use. And here's where all of the modern problems for Arizona's water supply start happening. Since 2000, the Southwest has been trapped in a historically significant mega drought. Snowpack in the Rocky Mountains has been diminishing in volume as the climate has warmed, which means that less water has been flowing into the Colorado River from its headwaters. Moreover, because of the overestimates of the 1922 Colorado River Compact, more water has been getting withdrawn from the Colorado River by the states around it than can be naturally replaced for decades, which has meant that the river has been getting thinner and thinner to the point where today its water flows are a third lower than historical averages, and the river doesn't even reach its natural delta at the Sea of Cortez in Mexico anymore, because all of its water is held up in reservoirs behind dams with
15. I already got them all. Oh, check. Okay. Clear PCI. Which is what? Purchase one item from Meta Human Dimension. Ravenous Hunter? What's the Ravenous Hunter? Hmm. Um. What? I don't see those little icons. Filter. What the fuck, dude? Where'd it go? There it is. Because it's close to. Oh, it's clutter. There. Now what? I'm already here. Oh, fuck these puzzles. Fucking hate these. Go. No! No! puzzle again? No, it's a number 2. Congratulations, getting your first clue is a number 2. Number 3. I'm telling you, it's 3, 2, 1. Five. Sneaky, sneaky, huh? Okay. Oh. Oh, God dang it. Just give me the fuck alone to figure this out. The other, wait, no. Got this one. 3. Oh, straight ahead. Clue. Where's the other clue? Damn it, dude, leave me the fuck alone. What is this fucking place? Son of a bitch, just go. What sheeps? It's 7 o'clock already and I haven't found this shit. Son of a fucking bitch, I'm done. This game has become boring, so I'm gonna play something else. Nice. That's a lot of pollution. Yeah. I guess I'll be coming back to the next season or something. Go ahead. Nice. Three. Two, right now. I have anything in here? Where do I have it? gotta go anyways. It was a waste of time today. Yeah, nobody's playing this no more. Dead. Yeah. Got it. Thanks. Oh, the fucking across the fucking map.
This place feels peaceful. I can't sense any stardust, memetics, anything. It's like we're frozen in time.
At least there's a bottle.
Let's start with the... Thank you, Meta. Beautiful place. Even the air tastes sweeter, but... How can this be possible?
You're an
When I'm in
alien and
this
so cute.
place, I can't feel the flow of time at all. I can't change anything here either. It's not source.
So
it's
it's heaven.
just sand. Very much so. Any materials from the outside world cannot be used directly here. You need to use astral sand to create. You can make all kinds of things with astral sand. It's easy. Here, let me show you. I'll tell you what. Let's start by fixing this place up.
Can I make
This
it my place?
world is in a constant state of flux, you see. If what we want is astral sand, all we need to do is speed up that process. And now, the transformation.
Don't need that. Don't need that. And yeah, that's gonna go bad. Definitely gonna go bad. And yeah, you can have that.
With that done, we can build whatever we like. Maybe you could start with the roof.
Okay, now what? Build, construct. Okay. Huh. No, nothing. Why would it go all the way down there? Oh. What now? Yeah, whatever. What now? Where's it taking me? There it goes.
Good work, Meta. I have to say, you're catching on quickly. Astral sand isn't just for construction. On this island, you can also use it to manipulate nature. Give it a shot. Try planting a tree.
Already did. Oi! Where's my tree? What?
Incoming transmission.
I was trying to be nice and leave you a tree. There you go. Okay. I am out of here. During my work hours, I'm most likely going to come back to Eternal and set up something. I'm going to build Trump Tower. Trump Tower. Yeah. We're going to build Trump Tower. It's going to be magnificent. Greatest tower ever built. We're leaving? We're leaving. Arrivederci. I like to say, get the hell out of here. Guys. Later, guys.